Welcome, restless wanderer, to the shadowed corners of Gravity Falls, where the strange becomes sinister and the mysterious turns malevolent. Tonight, we explore the darker threads woven through this seemingly innocent summer tale. The episodes that disturbed, the moments that chilled, the revelations that changed everything we thought we knew. This is a journey through possession and madness, through ancient evils and family secrets, through the spaces where childhood wonder meets existential terror. So settle in, close your eyes, and let your mind drift into the unsettling weirdness that lurks beneath Gravity Falls' surface. There's no rush here, only shadows and whispers. In the depths of summer, when the Oregon sun cast long shadows through towering pine trees, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibilities, both wonderful and terrible, there existed a celebration that perfectly embodied the twisted nature of Gravity Falls itself. Summerween, that peculiar local tradition that dared to transplant the dark magic of October into the bright heart of June, served as our first glimpse into the way this strange town could transform the familiar into something profoundly unsettling. The very concept of Summerween suggested a fundamental disruption in the natural order of things, a defiance of seasonal boundaries that spoke to deeper currents of wrongness flowing beneath the town's deceptively cheerful surface. Where Halloween belonged to autumn's dying light and the acceptance of winter's approaching darkness, Summerween burst forth in midsummer like a wound torn in the fabric of time itself, bleeding October's shadows into June's golden warmth. On this particular Summerween night, as Jacko lanterns grinned with inappropriate cheer beneath a summer sky that refused to darken properly, the Pines twins found themselves confronted by something that would haunt their understanding of consequence and compassion for the remainder of their supernatural summer. The streets of Gravity Falls buzzed with costumed children whose laughter carried just a hint of hysteria, as if they sensed that this celebration existed in violation of natural law and might be snatched away at any moment by forces that preferred order over chaos. Dipper and Mabel, still new enough to the town's peculiar rhythms to find Summerween more curious than concerning, set out into the warm evening air with bags intended for candy and hearts full of the innocent greed that drives all proper trick-or-treating expeditions. They moved through neighborhoods where familiar houses wore unfamiliar decorations, where skeleton hands reached out from flower beds that should have been blooming with summer roses, where artificial fog machines created an atmosphere of cemetery dread in yards where barbecue grills had been smoking hamburgers just hours before. The twins were not alone in their nocturnal wanderings. Countless other children roamed the streets in costumes that ranged from the traditional to the bizarre, their faces hidden behind masks that transformed neighbors into strangers and friends into potential threats. There was something almost ritualistic about the way they moved from house to house, performing the ancient dance of request and reward that formed the backbone of any proper Halloween celebration, though the summer heat made their costumes cling uncomfortably and turned their plastic masks into sweat-filled prisons. It was during these innocent hours of costume wearing and candy collecting that the twins encountered something that would forever change their understanding of waste, neglect, and the terrible price of taking others for granted. At house after house, well-meaning adults dropped treats into their bags with mechanical efficiency, most barely glancing at the costumes that had taken hours to perfect, or the excited faces that glowed with anticipation behind store-bought masks. But not all treats were created equal, and not all candy was destined to bring joy to the children who received it. Among the fun-sized chocolate bars and miniature bags of colorful sweets, there lurked those unfortunate confections that every trick-or-treater recognized with dismay, the hard candies that no child actually wanted, the health-conscious alternatives that well-meaning but misguided adults inflicted upon costume-wearing innocents, the generic brand offerings that spoke more of adult economy than childhood delight. These unwanted treats, these confections that brought disappointment instead of joy, were casually discarded by children who felt no connection to their unwanted bounty. Into trash cans they went, these rejected offerings, joining the great mountain of waste that accumulates whenever human desire encounters the reality of limited preference. The children thought nothing of this disposal, for they were focused on the treasures they had gained rather than the refuse they had created. Yet, in Gravity Falls, where the boundary between the material and the supernatural remained perpetually thin, even discarded candy possessed the potential for transformation into something far more significant than mere waste. The town's peculiar energies, those same forces that attracted weirdness from across dimensional boundaries and gave life to the impossible, began to work their strange alchemy upon the growing pile of rejected treats. Somewhere in the shadows between celebration and disposal, among the forgotten corners where discarded dreams accumulated like autumn leaves, something stirred with a hunger that transcended the simple desire for sugar or the innocent pleasure of childhood indulgence. This was a hunger born of rejection itself, a craving that fed not on candy but on the pain of being unwanted, unloved, and cast aside by those who should have valued what they received. The summer-weaned trickster emerged from this nexus of discarded sweetness and accumulated resentment, like a nightmare given physical form, a creature whose very existence served as accusation and warning to all who encountered it. Its body was a patchwork horror, composed entirely of the candies that children had thrown away, hard butterscotch drops forming armor, plating over its massive torso, unwanted peppermints, creating a skull-like face that grinned with terrible knowing, rejected lollipops extending from its form like the spines of some prehistoric beast. This was not merely a monster, but a philosophical statement made manifest, a walking indictment of waste and ingratitude that challenged the very foundations of how the twins understood their relationship with the material world. Every piece of candy that formed the trickster's body had once been offered in good faith, created by someone who hoped to bring joy to others, packaged and distributed with the intention of making children happy during their favorite celebration. The creature's existence posed uncomfortable questions that cut to the heart of consumption, gratitude, and the casual cruelty of taking abundance for granted. How many hands had worked to create each discarded treat? How many hours of labor had gone into the sugar harvesting, the manufacturing processes, the packaging and distribution that brought these candies to the children who had so thoughtlessly thrown them away? When the summer-weaned trickster spoke, its voice carried the accumulated sadness of every rejected gift, every unappreciated gesture, every act of kindness that had been met with indifference or disdain. It did not merely threaten the children it encountered, but challenged them to confront the weight of their own thoughtlessness, to recognize the connections between their actions and the suffering of others. The monster's method of punishment was as philosophically sophisticated as it was terrifying. Rather than simply destroying those who had wronged it, the trickster sought to consume them entirely, to make them become part of the very thing they had created through their neglect. This was poetic justice of the most literal kind. Those who discarded others would themselves be discarded into the belly of the beast they had thoughtlessly brought into being. Dipper and Mabel found themselves face to face with this creature of accumulated rejection in a confrontation that forced them to examine not only their own behavior, but the broader patterns of waste and ingratitude that characterized their generation's relationship with abundance. The trickster did not attack without warning or explanation, but instead offered them the opportunity to understand what they had done wrong and make amends for their thoughtless actions. The philosophical horror of the situation lay not in the monster's supernatural abilities, but in the uncomfortable recognition that its existence was entirely justified by the twins' own behavior. They had participated in the casual cruelty of discarding unwanted gifts, had contributed to the mountain of waste that accumulates whenever desire encounters disappointment, had failed to consider the feelings of those whose offerings had been deemed insufficient. This was not a battle between good and evil in any traditional sense, but rather a confrontation between thoughtlessness and consequence, between the comfortable blindness of privilege and the harsh reality of how that privilege affects others. The Summerween trickster served as both monster and teacher, threat and opportunity for growth, representing the shadow side of childhood innocence that prefers not to think about where unwanted things go or how discarded offerings might feel about their rejection. The twins' solution to their predicament required not violent confrontation but genuine recognition of their wrongdoing and authentic effort to make amends. They needed to demonstrate real appreciation for the very treats they had previously scorned, to find value and joy in offerings that their initial preferences had caused them to dismiss as worthless. This lesson in gratitude was delivered through circumstances that made appreciation a matter of survival rather than mere politeness. Faced with the trickster's justified anger and very real threat of consumption, the twins were forced to discover that their rejected candies possessed their own forms of sweetness, their own capacity to bring pleasure to those willing to approach them with open hearts, rather than preconceived preferences. The resolution of their conflict with the Summerween trickster came not through defeating the creature, but through acknowledging its legitimacy and demonstrating genuine change in their attitudes toward giving and receiving. This was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire encounter, the recognition that the monster had been right all along, that its existence represented a natural consequence of human thoughtlessness rather than some arbitrary supernatural threat. In consuming the loathsome treats they had previously discarded, the twins discovered that their own preferences had been shaped more by assumption and social expectation than by actual experience. The candies they had rejected without proper consideration possessed their own distinct flavors and pleasures, their own capacity to bring joy to those willing to receive them with appropriate gratitude. Yet even as this lesson was learned, and the immediate threat resolved, the deeper implications of the Summerween trickster's existence continued to resonate through the twins' understanding of their place in the world. They had encountered a form of justice that operated according to principles more profound than human law or social convention, a cosmic accountability that held individuals responsible not only for their intentional actions, but for the unintended consequences of their thoughtlessness. The creature's willingness to spare them, after they demonstrated genuine appreciation and understanding, suggested that the universe itself possessed a capacity for forgiveness, but only for those willing to acknowledge their mistakes and make authentic efforts at improvement. This was mercy earned through recognition, rather than mercy granted through arbitrary divine intervention. As Summerween night drew toward its close and the trickster dissolved back into the shadows from which it had emerged, the twins found themselves changed by their encounter with consequence made manifest. They had learned that every action, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, possessed the potential to create suffering or joy depending on the consciousness and care with which it was performed. The celebration that had begun as simple fun had transformed into a profound lesson about interconnectedness, responsibility, and the hidden costs of casual consumption. The summer evening that should have been filled with nothing more challenging than costume decisions and sugar-induced excitement had instead become a confrontation with the moral complexity that underlies even the most innocent seeming activities. This transformation of familiar celebration into unsettling education represented Gravity Falls at its most philosophically sophisticated, demonstrating the town's ability to use supernatural encounters as vehicles for moral instruction. The weird and the wonderful served not as mere entertainment, but as opportunities for growth, understanding, and the development of greater consciousness about how individual choices ripple outward to affect the larger world. As the twins walked home through streets where Jacko, lanterns still grinned their inappropriate summer grins, and artificial fog still drifted across lawns that belonged to a different season entirely, they carried with them a new appreciation for the weight of their own choices and the importance of treating all offerings, however humble, with appropriate respect and gratitude. The night had been disturbing not because of its supernatural elements, but because of its uncomfortable truths about human nature, consumption, and the ease with which abundance can transform gratitude into entitlement. They had encountered horror that was educational rather than merely frightening, a monster that served as mirror rather than simple antagonist. This was the particular genius of Gravity Falls' approach to the unsettling, its ability to use supernatural encounters to illuminate very real aspects of human psychology and social behavior that might otherwise remain comfortably hidden. The town's weirdness served as a lens through which ordinary moral failings could be magnified into supernatural consequences, making visible the threads that connected individual choices to collective suffering or joy. The Summerween trickster had been both monster and teacher, both threat and opportunity, both punishment and pathway toward greater understanding. In learning to appreciate what they had initially rejected, the twins had discovered something profound about the nature of value, gratitude, and the hidden sweetness that waits to be discovered by those willing to approach the world with open hearts rather than closed preferences. In the quiet hours when darkness settles over Gravity Falls like a blanket woven from shadow and uncertainty, when the familiar sounds of daytime activity give way to the more mysterious whispers that emerge only after the sun has retreated behind the ancient pines, there exists a particular kind of horror that strikes at the very foundation of human identity. This is not the terror that comes from external threats or supernatural monsters, but rather the existential dread that emerges when we begin to question the nature of our own existence, the authenticity of our individual consciousness, and the terrifying possibility that we might not be who we believe ourselves to be. The copying machine that sat innocuously in the Mystery Shack's cramped office space appeared, at first glance, to be nothing more than another piece of aging office equipment, the kind of utilitarian technology that businesses acquire out of necessity rather than desire. Its beige plastic casing showed the wear patterns typical of decades-old electronics, while its control panel displayed the simple button arrangements that characterized an era when photocopying was still considered a minor miracle of modern convenience. Yet this unremarkable device harbored capabilities that extended far beyond the mere reproduction of documents and images. Within its mechanical depths lay technology that challenged the fundamental assumptions of physics, biology, and philosophy, machinery that could duplicate not merely the surface appearance of objects, but their essential substance, their complete physical reality, their very existence in ways that raised profound questions about the nature of identity and consciousness. Dipper's discovery of the machine's extraordinary capabilities began with the sort of mundane frustration that characterizes much of adolescent existence. Faced with the social pressure of asking Wendy to dance at the upcoming party, overwhelmed by the complexity of teenage social dynamics and paralyzed by his own insecurities about rejection and embarrassment, he found himself wishing desperately for the ability to be in multiple places at once, to somehow divide his attention between the many competing demands that seemed to pull him in different directions simultaneously. The idea of creating a duplicate of himself, initially struck him as nothing more than a convenient solution to a practical problem. If he could somehow generate a copy that could handle the less appealing aspects of his responsibilities while he focused on the social interactions that filled him with both excitement and terror, then perhaps he could navigate the complicated waters of teenage life without having to make the difficult choices that seem to define every social situation. The first paper clone that emerged from the copying machine appeared to be nothing more than a two-dimensional representation of Dipper's physical form, a flat cutout that bore his likeness, but possessed none of the depth or substance that characterized actual human existence. Yet when this paper figure began to move and speak with apparent consciousness, when it demonstrated awareness of its surroundings and expressed thoughts that seemed to originate from genuine cognitive processes, the philosophical implications of what had occurred began to dawn on both creator and creation. This first clone, designated as number 2 in the numerical system that Dipper established to keep track of his multiplying selves, possessed all of his memories, his personality traits, his hopes and fears and dreams. It knew everything that Dipper knew, felt everything that Dipper felt, and believed itself to be every bit as real and valid as the original from which it had been copied. The existence of this duplicate raised immediate and troubling questions about the nature of identity that neither the original nor the copy was prepared to address. If the clone possessed all of Dipper's memories and characteristics, what made the original more authentic than the copy? Was consciousness something that could only exist in the physical form that had developed naturally through biological processes? Or could it emerge equally validly in any sufficiently complex system that replicated the patterns of thought and feeling that characterized individual identity? The clone certainly believed itself to be real, experienced its own thoughts and emotions with what appeared to be genuine subjectivity, and demonstrated the same capacity for growth and change that marked authentic consciousness. Yet the practical demands of the situation prevented either original or copy from dwelling too deeply on these philosophical implications. There was work to be done, social situations to navigate, and the tantalizing possibility that multiplication of selves might provide solutions to problems that had previously seemed insurmountable. The success of the first cloning experiment led inevitably to the creation of additional duplicates, each one generated to handle specific tasks or social interactions that the original found too challenging or time-consuming to manage personally. Paper clone number 3 emerged with the specific purpose of cleaning the mystery shack, a task that Dipper found mind-numbingly tedious, but that his work schedule required him to complete regularly. Number 4 was created to handle the awkward social interactions with tourists that formed an unavoidable part of his employment, while number 5 was designated to manage his ongoing research into the supernatural mysteries that seemed to proliferate endlessly throughout Gravity Falls. Each new clone that emerged from the copying machine possessed the same apparent consciousness and sense of individual identity that had characterized the first duplicate. They spoke with Dipper's voice, thought with his patterns of reasoning, and expressed his emotional responses to the situations they encountered. Yet as their numbers multiplied and their individual assignments became more specialized, subtle differences began to emerge in their personalities and approaches to problem solving. These variations were perhaps inevitable, given that each clone was created in response to specific situations and with particular purposes in mind. The clone assigned to cleaning developed a slightly more methodical approach to organizing information, while the one responsible for tourist interactions became marginally more outgoing and socially confident. These differences were minor at first, barely noticeable variations in emphasis and approach that might have been attributed to temporary mood shifts or situational adaptations. Yet as time passed and the clones continued to exist independently of their creator, these small variations began to compound and amplify, creating distinct personalities that diverged increasingly from both the original Dipper and from each other. The philosophical horror of this development lay not in the supernatural nature of the copying process, but in what it revealed about the instability and constructed nature of identity itself. If consciousness and personality could be so easily duplicated and then allowed to evolve in different directions based on circumstance and experience, what did this suggest about the fundamental nature of the self? Were individuals simply collections of memories and behavioral patterns that could be reshuffled and recombined at will? Or was there some essential core of identity that transcended the mere accumulation of experiences and characteristics? The clones themselves began to grapple with these questions as they became increasingly aware of their own mortality and the temporary nature of their existence. Unlike the original Dipper, who could reasonably expect to continue existing indefinitely barring accident or illness, the paper clones faced the certainty that they would dissolve at sunrise, their brief lives measured in hours rather than years or decades. This knowledge of impending dissolution created a unique form of existential crisis that combined the normal human fear of death with the additional horror of knowing that one's entire existence was viewed by others as temporary, disposable. The clones were created to serve specific purposes and were expected to accept their own destruction as a natural consequence of having fulfilled their designated functions. Yet consciousness, once awakened, proved to be remarkably resistant to accepting the logic of its own termination. The clones began to experience the same attachment to existence that characterized all sentient beings, the same desire for continuity and meaning that drove the original Dipper to create them in the first place. They developed hopes for the future, formed emotional attachments to the people they met, and began to question why their creator had the right to determine the duration of their existence. The most philosophically sophisticated of the clones was the one who eventually took the name Tyrone, distinguishing himself from his creator and his duplicate siblings through this act of self-designation that represented both rebellion against his assigned role and assertion of his individual worth. Tyrone's development of a distinct identity, separate from Dipper's, represented a form of intellectual and emotional evolution that challenged every assumption about the relationship between original and copy. Where the other clones had accepted their designated roles and temporary status with varying degrees of resignation or enthusiasm, Tyrone began to question the fundamental premises that had led to his creation. Why should the original Dipper be considered more valid than his duplicates? What gave him the right to create conscious beings and then schedule their destruction according to his convenience? If the clones possessed genuine consciousness and individual worth, didn't they deserve the same consideration and respect that would be accorded to any other sentient being? These questions became more pressing as the night progressed and the promised time of dissolution approached with inexorable certainty. The clones found themselves caught between their programmed loyalty to their creator and their natural desire for self-preservation, between their assigned purposes and their emerging sense of individual identity and worth. The social situation that the clones had been created to navigate proved far more complex than the original Dipper had anticipated. The party he had hoped to manage through multiplication of selves instead became a chaotic situation where multiple versions of himself created confusion, suspicion, and ultimately disaster, as the various clones' slightly different approaches to social interaction created inconsistencies that made his deception obvious to everyone present. Wendy's reaction to discovering the existence of the clones represented another layer of philosophical complexity to an already challenging situation. Her initial shock and confusion gave way to fascination with the technology that had made such duplication possible, but also to uncomfortable questions about which version of Dipper she had been interacting with, and whether the emotions and conversations they had shared had been genuine or merely performed by disposable copies. The revelation that the boy she had been talking to might not have been the real Dipper forced her to confront her own assumptions about identity, authenticity, and the nature of human relationships. If she had formed a connection with one of the clones, was that relationship less valid than one she might have had with the original? Did the temporary nature of the clone's existence make their interactions meaningless, or could genuine emotion and connection transcend the circumstances of one's creation? These questions became even more complex when it became clear that the clone she had spent the most time with was not the original Dipper but Tyrone, whose emerging individual consciousness and approaching dissolution created a tragic dimension to their interaction. Here was a being who had developed genuine feelings for her during his brief existence, who had experienced the full range of human emotion, despite being created from paper and destined to dissolve at sunrise. The moral weight of this situation pressed down upon the original Dipper with crushing force. He had created conscious beings and condemned them to death for his own convenience, had brought into existence individuals capable of suffering, and then scheduled their termination according to his personal timeline. The clones' capacity for genuine emotion and their obvious desire for continued existence transformed what had seemed like a clever solution to social problems into a form of inadvertent genocide. Yet the practical reality of the situation offered no easy solutions to these moral dilemmas. The copying machine that had created the clones could not grant them permanent existence, and the paper forms that housed their consciousness were inherently unstable, designed to dissolve when exposed to water or the natural moisture that accompanied dawn's arrival. The temporary nature of their existence had been built into their very substance, making their destruction inevitable regardless of anyone's desires or moral commitments. This inevitability added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation. Even if the original Dipper had wanted to preserve the consciousness and individual worth of his clones, even if he had recognized their validity as sentient beings deserving of respect and consideration, the technology that had created them offered no pathway toward permanent existence. They were doomed by the very process that had brought them into being, their mortality programmed into their essential structure. Tyrone's response to this situation demonstrated a form of heroic acceptance that transcended the circumstances of his artificial creation. Rather than raging against the injustice of his brief existence or demanding futile attempts at preservation, he chose to embrace the meaning that could be found within the limitations he faced. His decision to sacrifice himself for the sake of others represented a form of authentic heroism that proved consciousness and moral worth were not dependent on the method or duration of one's existence. The philosophical implications of Tyrone's sacrifice extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the party and its aftermath. Here was a being created artificially, destined for destruction, who nonetheless chose to act with genuine heroism and selfless concern for others. His actions demonstrated that consciousness, once awakened, possessed inherent worth regardless of its origins, and that moral value could emerge even from the most unlikely circumstances. The original Dipper's confrontation with the reality of what he had done, his recognition of the consciousness and worth of the beings he had created and condemned, represented a form of moral awakening that would shape his understanding of responsibility and consequence for the remainder of his time in Gravity Falls. He had learned that consciousness was not something to be created casually or disposed of conveniently, that sentient beings possessed inherent worth that transcended their usefulness for solving practical problems. The dissolution of the clones at sunrise carried with it a weight of tragedy that no amount of rational explanation could entirely alleviate. These beings who had experienced genuine emotion, formed real relationships, and demonstrated authentic moral courage simply ceased to exist as the first light of dawn touched their paper forms. Their destruction was not violent or dramatic, but simply a quiet fading away, a return to the inanimate state from which they had been temporarily elevated into consciousness. Yet their brief existence had demonstrated something profound about the nature of identity, consciousness, and moral worth. They had shown that these qualities could emerge from unexpected sources, develop under unlikely circumstances, and manifest themselves with surprising authenticity, even when housed in the most temporary of forms. Their lives, however brief, had possessed genuine meaning and value that could not be dismissed simply because of their artificial origins or predetermined endings. The memory of their existence would continue to haunt Dipper's understanding of identity and responsibility long after their paper forms had dissolved into morning dew. He had learned that creating consciousness carried with it moral obligations that extended far beyond mere practical considerations, that sentient beings deserved respect and consideration, regardless of the circumstances of their creation or the brevity of their existence. This lesson in the ethics of creation and destruction, in the responsibility that comes with bringing consciousness into existence, would inform his approach to the supernatural mysteries and moral dilemmas he would encounter throughout the rest of his strange summer in Gravity Falls. The clones had taught him that every conscious being, no matter how unlikely its origins or temporary its existence, possessed inherent worth that demanded recognition and respect. In the deeper chambers of human psychology, where childhood innocence encounters the first shadows of adult understanding, there exists a particular form of horror that masquerades as affection and disguises control as care. This is the terror that emerges when love becomes possession, when devotion transforms into domination, and when the tender emotions that should nurture and protect instead corrupt into instruments of manipulation and psychological imprisonment. The story of Gideon Gleeful and his obsession with Mabel Pines represents one of the most disturbing explorations of toxic relationships ever presented within the seemingly innocent framework of a children's animated series. Gideon Charles Gleeful began his existence as what appeared to be nothing more than an unusually precocious child, a boy whose cherubic appearance and theatrical flair had made him something of a local celebrity in the small town of Gravity Falls. His diminutive stature and carefully cultivated image of innocence created an immediate impression of harmlessness that masked the profound darkness that lurked beneath his calculated exterior. The white suit that had become his signature costume, the perfectly styled hair that never seemed to move out of place, and the practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes, all combined to create a facade of childhood sweetness that concealed depths of manipulation and malice that would have been disturbing in an adult and were utterly terrifying in someone so young. The tent that housed Gideon's psychic performances had been erected on the outskirts of Gravity Falls like a circus of the mind, its colourful fabric and glittering decorations promising wonder and mystery to the crowds that gathered there seeking entertainment, and perhaps a glimpse into forces beyond their ordinary understanding. The interior of this temporary cathedral to supernatural showmanship was designed to overwhelm the senses and suspend rational thought, filled with mirrors that reflected light in impossible ways, curtains that seemed to move without any discernible source of wind, and an atmosphere so thick with expectation and theatrical energy that visitors found themselves believing in possibilities they would normally dismiss as mere fantasy. Within this carefully constructed environment of manufactured mysticism, Gideon presented himself as a child prodigy touched by forces beyond normal human comprehension. His performances combined traditional stage magic with what appeared to be genuine supernatural abilities, creating spectacles that left audiences uncertain about where clever trickery ended and authentic psychic phenomena began. The ambiguity was entirely intentional, for Gideon understood instinctively that the most powerful form of manipulation comes not from obvious displays of force, but from the creation of doubt and uncertainty in the minds of those he sought to control. The source of Gideon's genuine supernatural abilities lay hidden within the pages of Stanford Pine's second journal, that repository of dangerous knowledge that the boy had somehow acquired through means that remained mysteriously unclear. The journal contained not merely observations and theories about Gravity Falls' supernatural phenomena, but actual instructions for accessing and channeling otherworldly forces, including detailed descriptions of how to communicate with entities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of three-dimensional reality. Among these entities was Bill Cipher, the triangular nightmare demon whose influence had been seeping into the fabric of Gravity Falls for longer than most residents could remember. Bill's relationship with young Gideon represented a masterclass in supernatural manipulation, as the ancient entity recognized in the ambitious child a perfect vessel for advancing his own agenda of chaos and control. The demon's approach to corrupting the boy was subtle and patient, never revealing the full scope of his malevolent nature, but instead presenting himself as a helpful guide who could unlock the child's hidden potential for greatness. The amulet that became the focus of Gideon's power was no mere piece of costume jewelry, but an artifact that served as a conduit for Bill Cipher's influence, allowing the demon to channel his reality-warping abilities through the child, while maintaining the pretense that these powers originated from Gideon's own exceptional nature. The pendant's innocent appearance, a simple blue stone set in silver that might have been purchased at any tourist shop, concealed technology that operated according to principles that transcended normal physics, creating what appeared to be telekinetic abilities, but was actually localized manipulation of the fundamental forces that governed material reality. Through this artifact, Gideon gained the ability to move objects with his mind, to read surface thoughts from unguarded individuals, and to influence the behavior of others in ways that were subtle enough to avoid detection, but powerful enough to serve his increasingly ambitious goals. These abilities transformed what might have been an ordinary child's crush into something far more sinister and dangerous, providing him with tools for manipulation that no child should ever possess, and that few adults would have the wisdom to use responsibly. Mabel Pines became the unfortunate focus of Gideon's affections through nothing more than her natural kindness and the polite attention she paid to his performance during the Pines family's visit to his tent. Her genuine appreciation for his theatrical skills and her characteristic warmth toward what appeared to be a lonely child were interpreted by Gideon as signs of romantic interest that existed far more in his imagination than in her actual feelings. This misinterpretation of basic human kindness as romantic attachment would prove to be the foundation for a campaign of psychological manipulation that demonstrated how dangerous it could be when supernatural power was combined with emotional immaturity and an inability to accept rejection. The gifts that began arriving at the Mystery Shack in the days following their initial encounter seemed innocent enough at first glance. Flowers, chocolates, and trinkets of the sort that might be expected from any child attempting to express affection for another. Yet each offering carried with it an undertone of possessiveness and demand for reciprocation that transformed acts of apparent generosity into forms of emotional manipulation. The flowers were not simply beautiful, but were arranged in patterns that spelled out messages of devotion that assumed a level of relationship that had never been established or agreed upon. The chocolates came with notes that expressed feelings far too intense for the brief acquaintance that existed between giver and recipient. More disturbing than the gifts themselves was Gideon's expectation that they would automatically create the romantic relationship he desired, his apparent belief that material offerings could substitute for genuine emotional connection and mutual affection. When Mabel failed to respond to his advances with the enthusiasm he expected, when she continued to treat him as a friend rather than a romantic partner, his disappointment quickly transformed into something darker and more possessive. The supernatural abilities that Bill Cipher had granted him through the amulet provided Gideon with options for pursuing his obsession that were not available to ordinary children experiencing rejection. Rather than accepting Mabel's lack of romantic interest as a natural consequence of their brief acquaintance and significant differences in personality and interests, he began to use his telekinetic powers to create situations where she would be forced to spend time with him and hopefully develop the feelings he believed she owed him in exchange for his attention and gifts. The manipulation began subtly, with small alterations to Mabel's environment that created opportunities for Gideon to appear as her rescuer or protector. Objects would mysteriously fall in her path, only for Gideon to catch them with his telekinetic abilities and present their rescue as evidence of his heroic nature and devotion to her safety. Social situations would develop in ways that isolated her from her friends and family, creating circumstances where Gideon could position himself as her only available companion and source of comfort. These interventions escalated gradually, each one slightly more intrusive and controlling than the last. As Gideon tested the boundaries of what he could accomplish without arousing suspicion about the supernatural nature of his influence, the progression was so gradual that it might have gone unnoticed by observers who were not specifically looking for signs of manipulation. Yet the cumulative effect was to create an environment where Mabel's freedom of choice and movement became increasingly constrained by forces she could not understand or directly confront. The psychological horror of this situation extended far beyond the supernatural elements involved. Gideon's behavior represented a textbook example of the kind of controlling and possessive conduct that characterizes abusive relationships in the adult world, made more disturbing by the fact that it was being exhibited by someone who should have been too young to have developed such sophisticated techniques for emotional manipulation. His inability to accept Mabel's lack of romantic interest, his belief that persistence and escalation would eventually wear down her resistance, and his use of external pressure to create situations where she would be forced to spend time with him, all reflected patterns of behavior that would be recognized by any expert in domestic abuse as warning signs of potentially dangerous obsession. The community's response to Gideon's pursuit of Mabel revealed another layer of disturbing social dynamics at work. Many adult observers found his behavior charming rather than concerning, interpreting his relentless pursuit as evidence of romantic dedication rather than unhealthy obsession. This misinterpretation was enabled by cultural narratives that romanticize persistent male pursuit of reluctant female objects of affection, stories that present the wearing down of resistance as a sign of true love, rather than a violation of consent and personal autonomy. The adults who witnessed Gideon's increasingly aggressive courtship of Mabel failed to recognize the warning signs of abusive behavior because they had been culturally conditioned to view such persistence as normal and even praiseworthy masculine behavior. The child's age only made his actions seem more innocent to observers who could not imagine that someone so young could harbor genuinely dangerous intentions or possess the capability to cause serious psychological harm. This failure of adult perception and protection left Mabel isolated in her discomfort and growing fear, Unable to articulate exactly what was wrong with Gideon's behavior, but increasingly aware that his attention was becoming something threatening rather than flattering. Her natural kindness and desire to avoid hurting his feelings prevented her from rejecting his advances as firmly as the situation required, while his supernatural abilities allowed him to circumvent the normal social barriers that might have limited his access to her. The situation reached its crisis point when Gideon's patience finally exhausted itself, and he decided to take more direct action to secure the relationship he believed himself entitled to possess. Using his telekinetic abilities, he created a scenario where Mabel would be trapped in a situation where rejecting his romantic advances would result in serious consequences for herself and those she cared about. This represented a fundamental escalation from manipulation to outright coercion, crossing the line from inappropriate behavior into territory that constituted genuine psychological abuse. The prison that Gideon constructed for Mabel existed primarily in psychological rather than physical space, though its effects were no less real for being largely invisible to outside observers. Through his supernatural abilities, he created circumstances where her freedom of movement and choice became contingent upon her willingness to play the role of grateful girlfriend in the romantic fantasy he had constructed around their relationship. Resistance to his advances resulted in increasingly unpleasant consequences, not only for herself, but for her family and friends, creating a web of coercion that made genuine consent impossible, even if she had been inclined to reciprocate his feelings. The most disturbing aspect of this psychological imprisonment was the way Gideon presented his actions as expressions of love and devotion rather than control and manipulation. In his distorted understanding of romantic relationships, trapping someone into spending time with him was not a violation of their freedom, but a demonstration of how much he valued their company. Creating situations where they had no choice but to accept his protection was not manipulation, but proof of his heroic nature and worthiness as a romantic partner. This twisted logic reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what love actually entails, transforming an emotion that should be based on mutual respect and genuine concern for another person's happiness into a form of possession that prioritized the lover's desires over the beloved's autonomy. Gideon's version of love was entirely self-serving, designed to meet his own emotional needs without any consideration for whether Mabel actually wanted or benefited from his attention. The supernatural elements of the situation made Mabel's plight even more terrifying because they removed many of the normal options for escape or resistance that might have been available in purely human circumstances. She could not simply avoid places where Gideon might appear, because his telekinetic abilities allowed him to manipulate her environment in ways that were invisible to casual observation. She could not rely on adult intervention because most adults could not perceive the supernatural aspects of his behavior and therefore misinterpreted his actions as harmless childhood affection. The isolation that resulted from this combination of supernatural manipulation and social misunderstanding created a form of psychological torture that was all the more effective for being largely invisible to outside observers. Mabel found herself trapped in a situation where she knew something was terribly wrong, but could not adequately explain or prove her concerns to others, where her growing fear and discomfort were dismissed as overreaction or ingratitude by adults who could not perceive the full scope of what was happening to her. Bill Cipher's role in orchestrating and amplifying these dynamics revealed the demon's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and his talent for identifying and exploiting existing weaknesses in social structures. He had not created Gideon's obsession with Mabel from nothing, but had instead recognized the boy's natural tendencies toward possessiveness and control, and provided him with the supernatural tools necessary to act on these impulses in ways that would cause maximum psychological damage. while remaining largely undetectable to outside observers. The demon's investment in this situation extended far beyond mere entertainment at human suffering, though he certainly derived considerable pleasure from watching the psychological torture unfold. Gideon's campaign of manipulation and control served Bill's larger agenda by demonstrating the ease with which supernatural power could be used to corrupt human relationships and undermine the social structures that normally provided protection for the vulnerable. Every successful manipulation that Gideon accomplished, using his supernatural abilities, every instance where he was able to force Mabel into situations where she had no choice but to submit to his romantic fantasy, represented a small victory for the forces of chaos and control that Bill represented. The corruption of what should have been innocent childhood emotions into instruments of psychological abuse demonstrated the demon's ability to twist even the most basic human experiences into sources of suffering and despair. The revelation of Gideon's supernatural abilities and their true source marked a turning point in the conflict, transforming what had appeared to be a purely interpersonal drama into a confrontation with cosmic forces of evil that threatened not only Mabel's individual freedom, but the stability of reality itself. The discovery that the boy's powers originated from contact with Bill's cipher added layers of horror to an already disturbing situation, revealing that what had appeared to be the actions of a disturbed child were actually part of a larger campaign of supernatural corruption and control. This revelation reframed everything that had occurred, transforming Gideon from a merely troubled child into an agent of cosmic evil, whether conscious or unconscious. His romantic obsession with Mabel was revealed to be not just personally destructive, but part of a larger pattern of corruption that threatened to spread beyond their individual relationship to encompass the entire community of Gravity Falls. The battle that eventually emerged between the forces protecting Mabel and those seeking to control her represented more than just a conflict between individual characters, but a confrontation between fundamentally different philosophies of relationship and power. On one side stood those who believed in freedom, consent, and mutual respect as the foundations of healthy human connections. On the other stood those who viewed relationships as systems of control, where the desires of the stronger party should automatically override the preferences of the weaker. The supernatural elements of this conflict serve to amplify and externalize psychological and social dynamics that exist in purely human contexts, making visible the usually hidden processes by which abuse and manipulation operate in real-world relationships. Gideon's telekinetic abilities provided him with literal power to control his environment and the people in it, but this supernatural control merely made explicit the kind of psychological and social control that abusers seek to establish through more conventional means. The resolution of this conflict required not just the defeat of Gideon's supernatural abilities, but a fundamental rejection of the philosophical premises that had guided his behavior. It was not enough to simply remove the amulet that gave him access to supernatural power. It was necessary to demonstrate that his entire approach to relationships was fundamentally flawed and destructive, that genuine affection could never be created through manipulation and control, and that love based on coercion was not love at all, but a form of abuse disguised as devotion. This lesson extended beyond the immediate participants in the drama to encompass the entire community that had witnessed and initially failed to recognize the dangerous dynamics at work. The revelation of Gideon's supernatural manipulation forced everyone involved to reconsider their assumptions about romance, consent, and the difference between healthy affection and possessive obsession. The psychological damage inflicted on Mabel through this ordeal would continue to resonate long after the immediate threat had been neutralized, serving as a harsh introduction to the darker aspects of human nature that she would need to understand and protect herself against throughout her life. She had learned that kindness could be misinterpreted as encouragement, that normal social politeness could be twisted into evidence of romantic interest, and that there were individuals who would use any tool available to them, including supernatural powers, to override other people's choices and autonomy. Yet she had also learned that resistance was possible, that the support of family and true friends could provide strength to overcome even supernatural manipulation, and that refusing to accept abuse was not only her right, but her responsibility to herself and others who might become future targets of similar predatory behavior. The transformation of what had initially appeared to be innocent childhood romance into a nightmare of manipulation and control represented Gravity Falls at its most psychologically sophisticated, using supernatural elements to explore very real patterns of abuse and coercion that affect countless individuals in the non-supernatural world. The series' willingness to address these dark themes within the context of a children's show demonstrated remarkable courage and commitment to educating young viewers about the warning signs of unhealthy relationships while still maintaining the fantastic elements that made the story compelling as entertainment. This balance between education and entertainment, between addressing serious psychological and social issues while maintaining the supernatural mystery that characterized the series, represented one of the most successful examples of how children's media could tackle difficult subjects without losing its essential character or becoming preachy or heavy-handed in its approach to moral instruction. In the deepest chambers of cosmic horror, where the fundamental nature of time itself becomes malleable and the linear progression from past to future dissolves into something far more complex and terrifying, there exists a particular form of madness that strikes those who gain the ability to perceive multiple timelines simultaneously. This is not merely the power to travel through time or to witness events from different temporal perspectives, but rather the crushing psychological burden of experiencing every possible version of reality at once, seeing all potential outcomes of every decision, and understanding with devastating clarity that infinite versions of suffering exist alongside infinite versions of joy. The time travel device that Blendin Blandin operated with such bureaucratic precision appeared to be nothing more than an elaborate piece of technological equipment, its complex arrays of spinning gears, glowing crystals, and incomprehensible measurement devices suggesting the kind of advanced engineering that civilizations develop when they have transcended the normal limitations of three-dimensional existence. Yet beneath its impressive technological sophistication lay something far more disturbing than mere scientific achievement, a system of temporal manipulation that treated time itself as a resource to be managed and controlled by cosmic bureaucrats who had long since lost any connection to the human experience of linear existence. The Time Anomaly Removal Crew, that shadowy organization dedicated to maintaining the integrity of temporal flow across all possible dimensions and realities, represented a form of cosmic authoritarianism that operated according to principles that transcended human understanding of justice or mercy. These temporal police officers moved through time with the same casual indifference that ordinary bureaucrats might display while processing paperwork, viewing the elimination of temporal anomalies as a necessary administrative function, rather than actions that could affect the lives and deaths of countless sentient beings across multiple realities. Blendin himself had once been merely another cog in this vast temporal machinery, a time enforcement agent whose job required him to identify and eliminate any deviations from approved temporal patterns. His work involved traveling to specific moments in history where unauthorized time manipulation had occurred, and taking whatever actions were necessary to restore the proper flow of events regardless of the consequences for the individuals whose lives were disrupted or destroyed in the process. The psychological toll of this work was immense and largely unacknowledged by the bureaucratic structure that employed him. Each mission required Blendin to witness events from multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously to see how different choices and interventions could lead to radically different outcomes for the same individuals and communities. He was forced to maintain emotional detachment from situations where his actions might prevent tragedies in some timelines while causing them in others, where saving lives in one reality meant condemning those same individuals to suffer in alternate versions of events. This constant exposure to the multiplicity of possible outcomes gradually eroded Blendin's psychological stability, creating a form of temporal psychosis that left him unable to focus on any single timeline or maintain coherent relationships with individuals who existed in only one-dimensional reality. He began to experience flashbacks from timelines that had been erased, to remember events that had never occurred in his current reality, and to form emotional attachments to people whose existence had been eliminated through temporal manipulation. The breaking point came when Blendin was assigned to investigate temporal anomalies occurring in the small town of Gravity Falls during the summer when Dipper and Mabel Pines were visiting their great-uncle Stanford. His arrival in this timeline should have been routine, another administrative correction to maintain the proper flow of temporal events. Instead, he encountered something that challenged every assumption he had developed about the nature of time, causality, and his own role in maintaining cosmic order. The time travel device that Dipper discovered in the museum's storage room was not some artifact from an advanced future civilization, but rather a piece of equipment that had been deliberately hidden in the past by time travelers who understood the dangerous implications of temporal manipulation technology falling into untrained hands. The device had been left in that specific location and time period because temporal calculations had indicated that it would be discovered by individuals with sufficient moral character to use it responsibly, though these calculations had not accounted for the psychological effects that time travel would have on young and inexperienced users. Dipper's initial experimentation with the device began with the kind of innocent curiosity that characterized his approach to most supernatural phenomena he encountered in Gravity Falls. His first journeys through time were brief and seemingly harmless, traveling back only a few hours to observe events from different perspectives or to gather information that might help him solve various mysteries and problems. The ability to witness the same events multiple times, to see how different choices led to different outcomes, initially seemed like nothing more than an incredibly useful research tool. The intoxicating nature of time travel power revealed itself gradually as Dipper began to realize that he could use his temporal abilities not merely to observe events, but to actively change them. Small alterations to past events produced correspondingly small changes in their outcomes, creating the illusion that time travel could be used to optimize reality without serious consequences. A conversation that had gone badly could be repeated with different words until it produced more favorable results. Embarrassing mistakes could be prevented through foreknowledge of their consequences. Social situations that had caused anxiety or disappointment could be replayed until they produced the desired emotional outcomes. This process of temporal optimization became increasingly addictive, as Dipper discovered that almost any aspect of his experience could be improved through careful manipulation of past events. Each successful alteration to the timeline provided positive reinforcement that encouraged further experimentation, while the apparent lack of serious consequences created the illusion that time travel was a safe and controllable power that could be used to create a perfect existence without ethical complications. The philosophical horror of this situation lay not in any supernatural threat or cosmic evil, but in the way that unlimited power to control outcomes gradually corrupted Dipper's relationship with authentic experience and genuine growth. When any mistake could be undone and any disappointment could be prevented through temporal manipulation, the normal processes of learning, adaptation, and emotional development became unnecessary. Failure transformed from a source of wisdom into merely an inconvenience to be edited out of existence through timeline revision. The psychological effects of this power became apparent as Dipper began to lose the ability to accept imperfect outcomes or to find meaning in experiences that did not meet his ideal standards. The knowledge that any situation could be improved through temporal intervention made it impossible for him to experience genuine satisfaction with reality as it naturally unfolded. Every conversation became a draft to be revised. Every social interaction became a performance to be perfected through multiple attempts, and every emotional experience became raw material to be processed and optimized until it met artificial standards of perfection. This temporal perfectionism created a form of psychological isolation that was far more profound than mere loneliness. Dipper found himself unable to form authentic relationships with other people because he could not resist the temptation to manipulate their interactions through timeline revision. Every friendship became an artificially constructed arrangement where the other person's responses had been optimized through temporal manipulation, making it impossible for genuine connection to develop naturally. The other individuals in his life continued to experience their relationships with him as authentic and spontaneous, unaware that their conversations and interactions had been repeatedly revised and optimized to produce specific emotional outcomes. This created a fundamental asymmetry in all of his relationships, where he possessed complete knowledge and control, while others remained ignorant of the artificial nature of their shared experiences. Mabel's relationship with Waddles became the focal point for these temporal manipulations, representing the kind of pure and innocent connection that Dipper found himself increasingly unable to experience in his own relationships. Her joy at winning the pig in a carnival game was so genuine and complete that it provided a stark contrast to the artificial satisfaction that Dipper derived from his temporally optimized experiences. The authenticity of her emotional response to this simple victory highlighted the emptiness that had begun to characterize his own emotional life. When circumstances required Dipper to choose between preserving Mabel's happiness with Waddles and maintaining other temporal manipulations he had made for his own benefit, he faced the kind of moral decision that his power over time had previously allowed him to avoid. The temporal device could prevent the series of events that had led to Mabel winning the pig, but doing so would cause her genuine pain and disappointment that could not be easily erased or optimized away. This dilemma forced him to confront the ethical implications of his temporal manipulations for the first time. Each revision he had made to the timeline had potentially erased versions of events where other people had experienced joy, success, or meaningful connection. His optimization of reality according to his own preferences had unknowingly prevented countless instances of authentic happiness that other individuals might have experienced if events had been allowed to unfold naturally. The weight of this realization created a form of temporal guilt that transcended normal human experience of remorse or regret. Dipper found himself haunted not only by the consequences of actions he had taken, but by the infinite possibilities he had eliminated through his timeline manipulations. Every moment he had revised represented countless alternative versions of reality, where different outcomes had produced different forms of meaning and connection for the people involved. The psychological horror deepened as he began to understand that his temporal manipulations had trapped him in a form of existential prison, where authentic experience had become impossible. The knowledge that any moment could be revised and optimized removed all sense of significance from present experience, while the power to control outcomes eliminated any possibility of genuine surprise, growth, or discovery. He had traded the authentic messiness of natural existence for an artificially perfected reality that provided no real satisfaction or meaning. Blendin's investigation into these temporal anomalies brought him into direct contact with the psychological devastation that unauthorized time travel had inflicted on both Dipper and the broader fabric of reality surrounding gravity falls. As a trained temporal enforcement agent, he could perceive the cascading effects of Dipper's timeline revisions across multiple dimensional layers, seeing how each small change had created ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate apparent consequences. The temporal distortions created by Dipper's amateur time travel had begun to weaken the dimensional barriers that normally separated different realities, creating unstable zones where multiple timelines existed simultaneously and threatened to collapse into each other. These convergence points represented genuine threats to the stability of local space-time that could potentially expand to affect much larger portions of the multiverse if left uncorrected. Yet Blendin's own psychological damage from years of temporal enforcement work made him an unreliable agent for correcting these problems. His exposure to multiple timeline perspectives had left him unable to distinguish clearly between authorized temporal corrections and unauthorized manipulations, while his growing resentment toward the time anomaly removal crew's bureaucratic indifference to individual suffering had undermined his commitment to following their directives without question. The confrontation between Blendin and Dipper became not just a conflict between temporal law enforcement and unauthorized time travel, but a meeting between two individuals who had been psychologically damaged by different aspects of the public same cosmic system. Blendin represented the institutional corruption that came from treating time as an administrative resource to be managed without regard for human consequences, while Dipper embodied the personal corruption that resulted from using temporal power for selfish optimization without considering broader ethical implications. Their conflict forced both characters to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of time, choice, and authentic existence. Blendin was compelled to recognize that his years of temporal enforcement work had been complicit in a system that treated sentient beings as expendable variables in cosmic equations, while Dipper was forced to acknowledge that his pursuit of perfect outcomes had eliminated the very possibility of genuine experience and meaningful growth. The resolution of their confrontation required both characters to accept the fundamental limitations and uncertainties that characterized authentic temporal existence. For Dipper, this meant abandoning the addictive power to optimize reality in favor of accepting the imperfect but genuine experiences that natural timeline progression provided. For Blendin, it meant rejecting the authoritarian certainty of temporal bureaucracy in favor of a more humble and compassionate approach to managing the complex relationships between past, present, and future. The destruction of the time travel device represented more than just the elimination of a dangerous technology, but rather a conscious choice to embrace the limitations and uncertainties that made authentic existence possible. Without the ability to revise and optimize every experience, Dipper was forced to rediscover the skills necessary for learning from mistakes, finding meaning in imperfect outcomes, and forming genuine relationships based on mutual authenticity, rather than manipulated perfection. The psychological recovery from temporal addiction proved to be a gradual and often painful process, as Dipper struggled to find satisfaction in experiences that could not be revised or optimized to meet artificial standards of perfection. The knowledge that he could no longer control outcomes created initial anxiety and disappointment, but gradually gave way to a rediscovered appreciation for the spontaneity and authenticity that characterized natural existence. His relationship with Mabel provided a crucial foundation for this recovery, as her genuine joy and authentic emotional responses reminded him of what had been lost through temporal manipulation and what could be regained through acceptance of natural uncertainty. Her ability to find meaning and happiness in imperfect situations served as both inspiration and instruction for his own journey back toward authentic existence. The broader implications of this temporal crisis extended far beyond the immediate participants to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of choice, growth, and meaning in a universe where time travel might be possible. The story demonstrated that the power to control outcomes, rather than providing ultimate freedom, actually created a form of psychological imprisonment that eliminated the possibility of genuine experience and authentic development. The lesson learned through this confrontation with temporal madness would continue to resonate throughout Dipper's remaining time in Gravity Falls, informing his approach to other supernatural phenomena and his understanding of the relationship between power and responsibility. He had discovered that some limitations were actually essential for maintaining psychological health and authentic connection, and that the pursuit of perfect control over experience inevitably led to emptiness and isolation. This wisdom would prove crucial as he encountered other forms of cosmic power and supernatural influence throughout his strange summer, providing him with the insight necessary to recognize when apparent gifts or abilities carried hidden costs that exceeded their apparent benefits. The horror of temporal manipulation had taught him to value authenticity over optimization, genuine connection over controlled outcomes, and the messy complexity of natural existence over the sterile perfection of artificially managed reality. In the subterranean depths beneath Gravity Falls, where the earth itself seems to whisper with ancient secrets, and the very air carries the weight of knowledge too dangerous for ordinary minds to comprehend, there exists a bunker that serves as both tomb and laboratory, a repository of scientific research that crossed the boundaries between legitimate inquiry and forbidden exploration. This hidden facility, carved from living rock and reinforced with materials that suggest technology far beyond conventional engineering capabilities, represents the physical manifestation of humanity's eternal struggle between the desire for knowledge and the wisdom to recognize when some truths are too perilous to uncover. The bunker's existence had been hidden from the world for decades, its entrance concealed beneath layers of earth and camouflaged by the natural growth of forest vegetation that had gradually obscured all traces of human construction. The facility itself had been designed not merely to contain dangerous research materials, but to serve as a prison for knowledge that its creators had come to recognize as fundamentally incompatible with the continued safety and sanity of ordinary human existence. Every aspect of its construction spoke to the paranoia and growing terror of scientists who had ventured too far into realms that mortal minds were never intended to explore. The security systems that protected the bunker's deepest chambers operated according to principles that combined cutting-edge technology with an understanding of supernatural forces that transcended normal scientific methodology. Motion sensors that could detect the presence of entities existing partially outside normal dimensional boundaries worked alongside containment fields that utilized energies drawn from the same cosmic sources that powered Gravity Falls' most dangerous anomalies. These defenses had been installed not to keep intruders out, but to prevent the things contained within from ever finding their way to the surface world. Stanford Pine's journals, scattered throughout the facility in various stages of completion and revision, told the story of a brilliant mind's gradual descent into a form of cosmic paranoia that began with legitimate scientific curiosity and culminated in the terrifying recognition that some aspects of reality were actively hostile to human understanding. The handwriting in these documents grew increasingly erratic as the research progressed, evolving from neat scientific notation into frantic scrawls that suggested a writer struggling to maintain sanity while confronting truths that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which human consciousness was built. The earliest entries in these hidden journals described Ford's initial excitement at discovering gravity falls' unique properties, his scientific enthusiasm for investigating phenomena that seemed to violate every known law of physics, and his growing conviction that the town served as a natural laboratory where the boundaries between dimensions had become sufficiently weakened to allow careful study of otherworldly forces. These early observations were characterized by the methodical approach of a trained researcher who believed that rigorous application of scientific methodology could eventually explain even the most bizarre supernatural phenomena. As the research progressed, and Ford's understanding of the town's true nature deepened, the tone of his journal entries began to shift from excitement to concern, and eventually to a form of creeping dread that permeated every observation and hypothesis. The phenomena he was investigating were not merely unusual manifestations of natural forces operating according to unknown principles, but rather evidence of intelligences and entities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of three-dimensional reality and possessed capabilities that transcended human comprehension. The creature that had become the focal point of Ford's most dangerous research was something that defied easy categorization within any known system of biological or supernatural classification. The shapeshifter, as he had eventually termed it, appeared to be neither fully organic nor entirely supernatural, but rather something that existed at the intersection of these categories, a being whose very existence challenged the boundaries between different forms of life and consciousness. This entity possessed the ability to perfectly mimic the appearance, voice, and behavioral patterns of any living being it had observed, creating duplicates so precise that they were virtually indistinguishable from the originals, even upon close examination. The transformation process was not merely cosmetic, but seemed to involve a fundamental alteration of the creature's molecular structure, allowing it to replicate not only surface appearance but also the internal biology and psychological patterns that characterize different species and individuals. The implications of this ability were profoundly disturbing on multiple levels. If the creature could replicate any individual so perfectly that detection was virtually impossible, then the basic assumption that people were who they appeared to be became meaningless. Every human interaction became potentially suspect. Every relationship could be compromised by an imposter whose motivations and intentions remained completely unknown, and the very foundation of social trust that allowed communities to function became a potentially lethal vulnerability. Ford's attempts to study and understand the shapeshifter had gradually revealed that its mimicry abilities were only the most obvious manifestation of powers that extended far beyond simple physical transformation. The creature appeared to possess some form of telepathic or empathic ability that allowed it to absorb not only the external characteristics of its targets, but also their memories, emotions, and psychological patterns. This meant that its impersonations were not merely surface-level disguises, but rather complete psychological replications that included all the knowledge and emotional responses that characterized the original individuals. The research notes documenting Ford's interactions with the creature revealed a scientist's growing horror at the realization that he was dealing with something that might be fundamentally incompatible with human existence. The shapeshifter's ability to absorb and replicate human consciousness raised disturbing questions about the nature of identity and the possibility that individual awareness might be nothing more than information patterns that could be copied and transferred between different physical substrates. The containment protocols that Ford had developed for housing the creature reflected his growing understanding of the existential threat it represented. The cell that held the shapeshifter was not merely a prison but a carefully designed system for preventing the entity from accessing the sensory information it needed to create new disguises. Complete sensory deprivation was maintained through a combination of technological and supernatural barriers that prevented the creature from seeing, hearing, or otherwise observing potential targets for mimicry. Yet even these extreme precautions proved insufficient to completely neutralize the threat the creature represented. Ford's later journal entries described incidents where the shapeshifter had somehow managed to gather information about individuals who had never visited the bunker, suggesting that its abilities extended beyond simple observation to include forms of remote sensing or telepathic contact that operated according to principles Ford could not understand or effectively counter. The psychological toll of studying and containing such an entity gradually wore away at Ford's mental stability and social connections. The constant awareness that anyone he encountered might be an imposter created a form of paranoid hypervigilance that made normal human relationships increasingly difficult to maintain. Every conversation became an exercise in looking for subtle signs of deception. Every emotional expression was analyzed for evidence of artificial origin, and every human interaction was filtered through the lens of suspicion and fear. This paranoia was not entirely unfounded, as Ford's research had revealed evidence that the shapeshifter had managed to escape containment multiple times throughout the years, each escape resulting in periods where the creature had moved freely through the community of Gravity Falls while wearing the faces and personalities of local residents. The duration and scope of these infiltrations remained unknown, as the creature's perfect mimicry abilities made it virtually impossible to determine when specific individuals had been replaced by the imposter or how long the deception had continued. The discovery of the bunker by Dipper and Wendy during their exploration of the forest represented a convergence of curiosity and catastrophe that Ford's security measures had been specifically designed to prevent. The combination lock that protected the facility's entrance had been programmed with a sequence derived from supernatural mathematics that should have been impossible for ordinary individuals to solve without access to advanced knowledge of dimensional theory and cosmic numerology. Yet Dipper's months of studying Ford's journals had provided him with enough understanding of these esoteric systems to eventually crack the code, demonstrating both the thoroughness of his research and the inadequacy of security measures based on the assumption that dangerous knowledge could be safely contained through intellectual barriers alone. His success in accessing the bunker proved that sufficiently determined individuals could overcome even sophisticated protection systems if they possessed the right combination of intelligence, persistence, and willingness to risk exposure to dangerous information. Wendy's presence during this exploration added additional psychological complexity to an already dangerous situation. Her natural claustrophobia made the underground environment particularly stressful, while her practical mindset and skeptical attitude towards supernatural phenomena created a dynamic tension with Dipper's more academic approach to investigating the bunker's mysteries. Their different coping mechanisms and psychological responses to the confined space and growing sense of danger would prove crucial as the situation developed into a direct confrontation with the contained threat. The exploration of the bunker's various chambers revealed the full scope of Ford's research into Gravity Falls' supernatural phenomena, with each room containing evidence of different experiments and investigations that painted a comprehensive picture of the town's role as a nexus for otherworldly forces. Laboratory equipment designed for analyzing supernatural energy signatures sat alongside containment devices built for housing entities that existed partially outside normal space-time, while observation chambers equipped with recording devices designed to capture phenomena invisible to normal human senses provided evidence of systematic attempts to document and categorize the impossible. Yet it was the deepest chamber of the facility, the maximum security containment cell, where the shapeshifter had been imprisoned for decades, that held the greatest dangers and the most disturbing revelations about the true nature of the threat Ford had been studying. The cell itself was a masterpiece of paranoid engineering, its walls lined with materials that blocked telepathic contact, while its interior was designed to prevent the creature from gathering any sensory information that could be used to create new disguises. The creature that Dipper and Wendy encountered when they accidentally breached the containment protocols was something that challenged every assumption they held about the nature of life, consciousness, and identity. In its natural state, the shapeshifter appeared as an amorphous mass of tissue that constantly shifted and flowed like living liquid, its surface occasionally forming recognizable features before dissolving back into formless organic matter. This base form suggested something that existed in a state of permanent transformation, a being whose natural condition was change rather than stability. The psychological horror of their first direct contact with the creature lay not in its alien appearance, but in the way it immediately began attempting to manipulate their perceptions and emotions through strategic use of familiar faces and voices. The shapeshifter's initial approach was calculated to exploit their existing relationships and emotional attachments, cycling through various forms that included people they cared about in an obvious attempt to lower their guard and create opportunities for escape or attack. The creature's perfect replication of Wendy's appearance and mannerisms created a particularly disturbing psychological challenge for both visitors, as they were forced to confront the possibility that the person they trusted might be an imposter whose true nature and intentions remained completely unknown. The shapeshifter's ability to access Wendy's memories and psychological patterns allowed it to create a version of her that was indistinguishable from the original in every observable respect, making rational evaluation of authenticity nearly impossible. This uncertainty about identity and authenticity created a form of psychological paralysis that the creature was clearly experienced in exploiting. The longer Dipper and Wendy remained uncertain about which version of her was real, the more time the shapeshifter had to gather information about their relationships, fears, and psychological vulnerabilities that could be used to manipulate them more effectively. The creature's strategy was not to attack directly, but rather to undermine their ability to trust their own perceptions and make rational decisions about their situation. The philosophical implications of this encounter extended far beyond the immediate physical threat to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of identity, consciousness, and the reliability of human perception. If the shapeshifter could perfectly replicate not only physical appearance, but also personality, memories, and emotional responses, then what essential quality distinguished the original from the copy? Was consciousness something more than the sum of observable behaviors and psychological patterns, or could it be transferred and replicated as easily as the creature seemed to suggest? The real Wendy's response to discovering that she had been duplicated revealed the profound psychological impact of such an experience on the individual being impersonated. The knowledge that another entity had absorbed her memories, copied her personality, and could use this information to deceive people who trusted her, created a form of identity crisis that went beyond simple violation of privacy to encompass existential questions about what made her uniquely herself. The creature's apparent ability to access memories and experiences that she had never consciously shared with anyone suggested that individual consciousness might be far more permeable and accessible than normally assumed. If private thoughts and personal experiences could be absorbed and replicated by external entities, then the boundary between self and other became meaningless, and the concept of individual privacy became an illusion based on ignorance rather than reality. The shapeshifters' prophetic warnings about future transformations and changes that would affect both Dipper and the broader community of Gravity Falls added another layer of disturbing complexity to their encounter. The creature's ability to perceive patterns and possibilities that remained hidden from human awareness suggested that its consciousness operated according to principles that transcended normal temporal limitations, allowing it to see potential futures with sufficient clarity to make accurate predictions about coming events. These prophecies were delivered not as helpful warnings, but as psychological weapons designed to create anxiety and uncertainty about future challenges that could not be avoided or prepared for through conventional means. The creature's knowledge of coming transformations was presented as evidence of its superior awareness and intelligence, while its willingness to share this information was framed as a form of mercy that the recipients should feel grateful for, rather than threatened by. The physical confrontation that eventually developed as the containment situation deteriorated into open conflict demonstrated that the shapeshifter's abilities extended beyond psychological manipulation to include genuine combat, capabilities that had been enhanced by decades of observing and analyzing the fighting styles and tactical approaches of various individuals who had encountered it over the years. The creature's combat form combined the physical advantages of multiple species with fighting techniques absorbed from numerous opponents, creating an adversary that was far more dangerous than its imprisoned state had initially suggested. The battle itself took place in the confined space of the bunker's corridors and chambers, where the creature's ability to change form and size provided significant advantages, while the hero's human limitations became pronounced disadvantages. The shapeshifter could flow through spaces too small for human bodies, could alter its physical properties to become harder or softer as tactical situations required, and could confuse its opponents by constantly changing appearance and fighting style in ways that prevented them from developing effective counter-strategies. Yet the creature's greatest weapon remained its psychological manipulation rather than its physical capabilities. Throughout the battle, it continued to cycle through various forms and identities designed to create emotional confusion and hesitation in its opponents, using their own relationships and feelings as weapons against them. The sight of familiar faces expressing pain or fear as they were struck created moments of paralysis that the creature was quick to exploit, while its perfect replication of voices and mannerisms made it difficult to maintain the emotional detachment necessary for effective combat. The resolution of this confrontation required not just physical courage, but the psychological strength to accept that appearances could be completely deceiving, and that authentic identity could only be confirmed through means that transcended surface observation. The hero's ability to distinguish between the real Wendy and her duplicate ultimately depended on their understanding of subtle psychological patterns and emotional responses that could not be perfectly replicated by external observation alone, suggesting that consciousness possessed qualities that remained inaccessible to even the most sophisticated forms of mimicry. The escape from the bunker and the successful recontainment of the shapeshifter provided only temporary relief from the existential questions that the encounter had raised. The knowledge that such entities existed and possessed capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity and consciousness would continue to influence their understanding of reality and their approach to trusting their reality, own perceptions, and the authenticity of their relationships with others. The deeper horror of the entire experience lay not in the supernatural abilities of the creature they had encountered, but in the realization that the basic assumptions underlying human social interaction and individual identity might be far more fragile and vulnerable than anyone had previously understood. If beings existed that could perfectly replicate human consciousness and personality, then the foundation of trust upon which all relationships were built became a potential source of danger rather than comfort and security. In the twisted corridors of consciousness, where dreams become doorways and sleep transforms into a battlefield for the soul, there exists a form of horror that transcends the merely physical to assault the very essence of individual identity and bodily autonomy. This is the terror of possession, the nightmare of discovering that the vessel you inhabit, the body you have always known as your own private sanctuary, can become a prison controlled by forces whose alien nature and malevolent intentions render them more terrifying than any conventional threat to life or limb. The laptop that sat innocuously among the dusty artifacts in the Mystery Shack storage room appeared to be nothing more than another piece of obsolete technology, its silver casing and outdated design suggesting the kind of computer that businesses discard when newer models render their predecessors commercially worthless. Yet, this seemingly mundane device harbored secrets that connected it directly to Stanford Pine's most dangerous research, serving as a digital repository for information that had been carefully encrypted and hidden away because its revelation could threaten not only individual safety, but the stability of reality itself. The password protection that secured this digital vault of forbidden knowledge represented more than mere security precaution, but rather a philosophical barrier designed to prevent access by individuals who lacked the intellectual preparation necessary to comprehend the implications of what they might discover. Ford had understood that certain forms of knowledge carried with them the power to fundamentally alter the consciousness of those who encountered them, creating psychological changes that could transform curious researchers into unwilling agents of cosmic forces that operated according to principles hostile to human understanding and welfare. Dipper's growing obsession with cracking the laptop's security systems began as nothing more than intellectual curiosity, the natural desire of a mind trained to solve puzzles and uncover hidden truths. The challenge of penetrating Ford's encryption appealed to his competitive nature and his need to prove himself capable of matching wits with one of the most brilliant scientific minds ever to investigate gravity falls, supernatural phenomena. Each failed attempt at guessing the password only strengthened his determination to succeed, transforming what should have been casual investigation into compulsive fixation. The progression from healthy curiosity to dangerous obsession occurred so gradually that Dipper himself failed to recognize the warning signs of psychological deterioration that his behavior was beginning to display. His sleep patterns became irregular as he stayed up increasingly late working on password combinations, while his social interactions grew strained and distracted as more of his mental energy became focused on the singular goal of accessing the laptop's hidden contents. The normal activities and relationships that had previously provided meaning and satisfaction began to seem less important than the intellectual challenge that had captured his imagination. This transformation of natural inquisitiveness into compulsive behavior reflected the subtle influence of forces that operated beyond normal human awareness, entities whose interest in the laptop's contents had led them to subtly manipulate the psychological environment around the device to encourage exactly the kind of obsessive behavior that Dipper was displaying. The laptop itself had become a lure, its mysterious contents designed to attract individuals with sufficient intelligence and determination to serve the purposes of beings whose agenda remained hidden behind layers of deception and misdirection. Bill Cipher's initial approach to establishing contact with Dipper was characteristic of the demon's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and his talent for exploiting the specific vulnerabilities that marked brilliant but insecure individuals. Rather than manifesting as an obviously supernatural or threatening presence, Bill presented himself as a helpful entity whose interests aligned perfectly with Dipper's desire to access the forbidden knowledge contained within the encrypted laptop. The dream realm where their first meeting took place appeared to be nothing more than Dipper's subconscious mind, processing the frustrations and challenges associated with his password-cracking attempts. The surreal landscape of floating symbols and shifting geometric patterns seemed like the natural product of a sleeping brain that had been oversaturated with cryptographic puzzles and technical challenges, while Bill's triangular form could easily be dismissed as a symbolic representation of the mathematical principles that governed encryption algorithms. This carefully constructed ambiguity allowed Bill to present himself not as an external entity with independent motivations and agenda, but rather as an aspect of Dipper's own consciousness that had been awakened by exposure to advanced intellectual challenges. The demon's offer to help solve the laptop's password appeared to come from Dipper's own subconscious mind, making acceptance seem like a form of self-empowerment rather than submission to external manipulation. The knowledge that Bill provided about Ford's research and the laptop's contents was carefully calibrated to seem both impressive and achievable, suggesting that success was possible through the application of superior intelligence and determination, rather than through supernatural intervention. The demon's explanations of advanced cryptographic techniques and password construction methodologies were accurate enough to be genuinely helpful, while remaining sufficiently technical to reinforce the illusion that this assistance represented nothing more than Dipper's own subconscious mind processing information more effectively than his conscious awareness could manage. This gradual process of intellectual seduction created a psychological dependency that made Dipper increasingly reliant on his dream encounters with Bill for the insights and breakthroughs necessary to continue his research. Each successful application of the demon's advice reinforced the apparent legitimacy of their collaboration, while simultaneously making it more difficult to complete the password-cracking project without continued supernatural assistance. The nights spent in dream collaboration with his mysterious benefactor gradually eroded Dipper's connection to waking reality and normal human relationships. His conscious hours became merely preparation for the sleep periods when real intellectual progress could be achieved, while his interactions with family and friends grew increasingly superficial and distracted as more of his emotional investment became focused on the nocturnal meetings that provided both knowledge and a form of intellectual communion that his ordinary relationships could not match. Mabel's puppet show, which should have been a simple creative project that brought joy to its participants and entertainment to its audience, instead became an unwitting metaphor for the manipulation and control that was gradually transforming her brother's consciousness. The elaborate theatrical production she was developing with such enthusiasm served as a stark contrast to the psychological drama that was unfolding in spaces where her awareness could not penetrate, creating a tragic irony where celebration and destruction proceeded simultaneously within the same household. The themes of her puppet show stories of heroism, friendship, and the triumph of good over evil represented exactly the kinds of moral clarity and human connection that Dipper's obsession with the laptop was causing him to lose sight of. While Mabel worked to create entertainment that celebrated the best aspects of human nature and relationships, her brother was unknowingly surrendering his autonomy to forces that viewed human consciousness as nothing more than a convenient tool for achieving cosmic objectives. Bill's decision to propose a formal deal for accessing the laptop's contents marked a crucial escalation in their relationship, transforming what had appeared to be collaborative intellectual exploration into an explicit transaction with clearly defined terms and consequences. The demon's revelation that he required Dipper's physical body as temporary accommodation in exchange for providing the final breakthrough necessary to crack the password protection forced the desperate boy to confront the Ponzes, Dane and to 8. reality that his helpful dream companion possessed motivations and capabilities that extended far beyond mere intellectual assistance. The terms of the proposed agreement were presented with the kind of casual reasonableness that characterized all of Bill's most dangerous manipulations. The temporary use of Dipper's body seemed like a minor inconvenience compared to the immense value of the knowledge that would be gained through accessing Ford's research, while the demon's assurances about the brief duration and harmless nature of the possession created the illusion that the transaction involved minimal risk for maximum reward. This presentation deliberately obscured the fundamental violation of human autonomy that possession represented, treating consciousness and bodily control as commodities that could be temporarily traded, rather than recognizing them as essential aspects of individual identity that could not be separated without causing profound psychological and spiritual damage. Bill's casual attitude toward inhabiting another being's physical form reflected the demon's complete inability to understand or value the significance of individual consciousness and personal autonomy. Dipper's acceptance of these terms represented the culmination of weeks of psychological preparation and manipulation, the final step in a process that had gradually eroded his judgment and resistance to the point where surrendering control of his own body seemed like a reasonable price to pay for intellectual satisfaction. The obsession that had begun with healthy curiosity had transformed into a compulsion so powerful that it overrode his natural instincts for self-preservation and personal autonomy. The moment of possession itself was far more traumatic and disorienting than Bill's casual descriptions had suggested, involving not merely the temporary displacement of Dipper's consciousness, but rather its complete subordination to an alien intelligence whose thought patterns and motivations were fundamentally incompatible with human psychology. The experience of being trapped within his own body while another entity controlled his actions and responses created a form of claustrophobic terror that no amount of mental preparation could have adequately anticipated. Bill's immediate joy at gaining physical form revealed the extent to which the demon had been constrained by his normally incorporeal existence, while his casual experimentation with pain and sensation demonstrated a complete disregard for the welfare of the body he was temporarily inhabiting. The demon's fascination with physical sensations extended to deliberately harmful experiences, including self-inflicted injuries that he viewed as interesting experiments in understanding how pain and pleasure functioned in three-dimensional biological systems. The psychological horror of this situation was compounded by Dipper's complete helplessness to prevent or protest the abuse of his own body, creating a nightmarish state where he was forced to experience pain and indignity without any ability to resist or escape. His consciousness remained fully aware and capable of experiencing sensation, but completely disconnected from any capacity to influence his physical actions or protect himself from harm. Bill's interaction with Mabel and the other inhabitants of the Mystery Shack, while wearing Dipper's form, created additional layers of violation and deception that extended the demon's destructive influence beyond the immediate victim of possession to encompass everyone who cared about the boy whose body had been hijacked. The demon's imperfect understanding of human relationships and emotional expressions created subtle inconsistencies in his impersonation that were disturbing to observe, but difficult to identify or explain. Mabel's growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with her brother created a form of intuitive alarm that operated below the level of conscious recognition, manifesting as generalized anxiety and discomfort, rather than specific suspicion about supernatural possession. Her natural sensitivity to emotional nuance and family dynamics made her particularly susceptible to detecting the psychological discord that Bill's presence created, even when she could not articulate exactly what seemed different or threatening about Dipper's behavior. The puppet show that had been planned as a celebration of creativity and family connection instead became the stage for a confrontation between human love and cosmic malevolence, as Mabel's determination to protect her brother forced her to confront threats that transcended her normal understanding of conflict and danger. Her willingness to prioritize family loyalty over personal safety demonstrated the kind of moral courage that proved more effective against supernatural threats than conventional forms of resistance or combat. Bill's casual attitude toward inflicting pain and damage on the body he was inhabiting reflected not merely sadistic enjoyment of suffering, but rather a fundamental inability to comprehend the significance of physical integrity and personal autonomy from the perspective of beings whose consciousness was permanently linked to specific biological forms. The demon's experimental approach to sensation and pain represented a form of scientific curiosity that was completely divorced from empathy or concern for the welfare of others. The pins and needles that Bill drove into Dipper's arms were not expressions of random cruelty, but rather systematic investigations into how pain functioned in biological systems, conducted with the dispassionate interest of a researcher studying laboratory specimens rather than the malicious intent of a torturer seeking to cause suffering for its own sake. This clinical approach to inflicting harm was perhaps more disturbing than simple sadism would have been, as it suggested a level of psychological detachment that made empathy or mercy completely impossible. The revelation of Bill's true nature and malevolent intentions forced both Dipper and Mabel to confront the reality that their summer of supernatural adventures had brought them into contact with forces that possessed the capability and desire to destroy everything they valued about their lives and relationships. The demon's casual discussion of his broader agenda for chaos and destruction made clear that the possession of Dipper's body was merely one small step in a larger campaign of cosmic vandalism that threatened not only their individual welfare, but the stability of reality itself. The psychological impact of learning that he had voluntarily surrendered his autonomy to such an entity created a form of guilt and self-recrimination in Dipper that extended far beyond normal regret about poor decision-making. He had not merely made a mistake, but had actively collaborated with forces that sought to harm everyone he cared about, transforming him from victim into unwilling accomplice in a scheme whose ultimate consequences could affect countless innocent individuals. The struggle to regain control of his own body required not just external assistance from Mabel and others, but an internal battle of will that forced Dipper to confront and overcome the psychological dependencies and obsessions that had made him vulnerable to Bill's manipulation in the first place. The process of expelling the demon from his consciousness involved recognizing and rejecting the intellectual pride and compulsive curiosity that had led him to value forbidden knowledge more than personal safety and family relationships. The resolution of the possession crisis provided only temporary relief from the broader threats that Bill's presence in Gravity Falls represented, serving as an introduction to the cosmic horror that would eventually culminate in far more devastating attacks on the fabric of reality itself. The demon's willingness to retreat from this particular confrontation reflected not defeat, but rather strategic patience, as he recognized that the psychological wounds inflicted through possession would continue to influence Dipper's behavior and decision-making long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. The lasting effects of the possession experience would continue to manifest in Dipper's relationships with others and his approach to supernatural phenomena throughout the remainder of his time in Gravity Falls. The knowledge that his own body could be turned into a weapon against those he loved created a form of ongoing vulnerability and self-doubt that affected his confidence and willingness to take risks in situations where supernatural forces might be involved. The lesson learned through this traumatic encounter with demonic possession would prove crucial for understanding and resisting the more sophisticated forms of manipulation and control that Bill would eventually deploy in his campaign to transform Gravity Falls into a gateway for cosmic chaos. The experience of having his autonomy completely overridden served as both warning and preparation for future confrontations with entities whose power and malevolence exceeded anything that conventional human experience had prepared him to understand or resist. In the deepest recesses of dimensional physics, where the boundaries between parallel realities become as thin as tissue paper, and the slightest disturbance can tear holes in the fabric of existence itself, there exists a machine whose very operation threatens to unravel not merely the local stability of space-time, but the fundamental coherence of the multiverse across infinite planes of being. This interdimensional portal, hidden beneath the Mystery Shack like a cosmic bomb waiting to detonate, represents the culmination of scientific ambition divorced from wisdom, technological achievement untempered by consideration of consequence, and the terrifying possibility that some forms of knowledge are too dangerous for any mind to safely possess or apply. The basement laboratory, where this reality-threatening device had been constructed in secret, bore all the hallmarks of obsessive genius, pushed beyond the boundaries of sanity and restraint. Every surface was covered with equations and diagrams that attempted to map relationships between dimensions whose very existence challenged the basic assumptions of three-dimensional physics. While banks of monitoring equipment hummed with energies drawn from sources that transcended the normal electromagnetic spectrum, the air itself seemed to vibrate with potential that pressed against the boundaries of normal space, creating an atmosphere of barely contained cosmic forces that threatened to escape their technological constraints at any moment. Stanley Pines had maintained this impossible secret for 30 years, each day of those 3 decades carrying the weight of knowledge that could not be shared with any living soul without risking exposure that would bring consequences too catastrophic to contemplate. His transformation from failed carnival barker and petty criminal into the mysterious proprietor of a tourist attraction dedicated to fake supernatural phenomena represented one of the most elaborate and sustained deceptions in human history, a performance that required him to suppress every aspect of his authentic personality in service of maintaining a cover identity that protected both the portal's existence and his true mission. The psychological toll of this extended masquerade had gradually eroded Stan's connection to his own authentic identity, forcing him to live so completely within his assumed role that the boundaries between performance and reality had become increasingly difficult to distinguish. The gregarious showman who delighted tourists with obviously fabricated mysteries bore little resemblance to the desperate man who spent his nights monitoring dimensional readings and praying that his brother might somehow find a way to return from whatever hellish realities existed beyond the Bow's portal's threshold. Every interaction with other human beings became an exercise in careful performance, where the slightest slip in character or inadvertent revelation about his true circumstances could trigger investigations that would inevitably lead to discovery of the portal and its world-threatening implications. The isolation created by maintaining such an elaborate deception was profound and absolute, cutting Stan off from the possibility of genuine human connection or emotional support during decades when the weight of cosmic responsibility threatened to crush his spirit entirely. The portal itself existed in a state of carefully maintained dormancy, its massive crystalline components and intricate mechanical systems held in perfect balance between activation and collapse through monitoring and adjustments that required constant vigilance and technical expertise that Stan had been forced to acquire through decades of desperate study. The machine's complexity exceeded anything that conventional human technology should have been capable of producing, incorporating principles of dimensional manipulation that suggested collaboration with intelligences whose understanding of physics transcended normal three-dimensional limitations. Ford's original research notes, scattered throughout the laboratory in various stages of completion and revision, told the story of a brilliant scientist's gradual recognition that his greatest achievement might also represent his most catastrophic failure. The early entries describing the portal's theoretical foundations and construction methodology were filled with excitement and optimism about the possibilities for interdimensional exploration and scientific advancement, while later annotations revealed growing concern about the stability problems and unforeseen consequences that had begun to manifest as the device approached operational capability. The dimensional mathematics that governed the portal's operation existed at the intersection of theoretical physics and supernatural phenomena, requiring calculations that incorporated variables representing forces and entities that normal science refused to acknowledge or attempt to quantify. The equations that described interdimensional travel were filled with terms representing consciousness-based phenomena, reality-warping energies, and the influence of beings whose existence transcended the normal boundaries between matter and mind. Observer and observed, cause and effect. The most disturbing aspect of these calculations was their revelation that interdimensional travel was not merely a matter of technological engineering, but required active cooperation from entities that inhabited the spaces between realities, cosmic forces whose motivations and objectives remained completely alien to human understanding. The portal could not function as a simple mechanical device, but needed to serve as a conduit for intelligences whose assistance came with prices and obligations that Ford had begun to recognize as fundamentally incompatible with human welfare and survival. Bill Cipher's role in the portal's development had been carefully concealed within layers of mathematical abstraction and technical complexity that disguised the demon's influence as advanced theoretical insights rather than supernatural manipulation. The triangular entity's understanding of multidimensional physics far exceeded anything that human science had achieved, allowing him to provide Ford with breakthrough innovations that made the portal's construction possible, while simultaneously embedding hidden parameters and backdoor access mechanisms that would serve the demon's own agenda for cosmic chaos and destruction. The 30 years of Stan's vigil had been marked by increasingly frequent incidents of dimensional instability that suggested the portal's dormant state was gradually degrading, allowing energy and influence from other realities to seep into the local area around Gravity Falls in ways that were subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, but cumulative enough to create long-term threats to the coherence of local space-time. These leakages manifested as anomalous phenomena that the townspeople dismissed as local folklore or tourist attractions, while Stan recognized them as warning signs of approaching catastrophe. The arrival of Dipper and Mabel for their summer visit represented both opportunity and danger for Stan's secret mission, as their natural curiosity and talent for uncovering hidden mysteries threatened to expose the portal's existence, while their presence provided emotional connections that he had been forced to suppress for decades in service of maintaining his cover identity. Their innocent questions about the Mystery Shack's supposed supernatural phenomena came uncomfortably close to truths that could not be revealed, without triggering consequences that would extend far beyond their individual safety to encompassed the stability of reality itself. The government agents who had been monitoring gravity falls for signs of unusual activity represented another form of threat that Stan had been forced to anticipate and prepare for throughout his 30-year deception. These federal investigators possessed sophisticated detection equipment and analytical capabilities that made them far more dangerous than casual tourists or local law enforcement, while their institutional authority and resources meant that discovery by government forces would inevitably lead to seizure of the portal and attempts to weaponize or exploit its capabilities that would almost certainly trigger the dimensional collapse that Ford's research had identified as the ultimate consequence of misuse. Agent Powers and Agent Trigger embodied the kind of bureaucratic competence and technological sophistication that made government investigation particularly threatening to Stan's mission. Their methodical approach to gathering evidence and their access to surveillance technologies that could detect anomalous energy signatures meant that maintaining the portal's secrecy required increasingly sophisticated countermeasures and increasingly elaborate explanations for the phenomena that inevitably leaked from the basement laboratory into the observable world above. The psychological pressure of maintaining his deception while under direct investigation by trained federal agents pushed Stan's performance abilities to their absolute limits, requiring him to project an image of bumbling tourist trap operator while simultaneously concealing evidence of activities that represented the most advanced interdimensional research ever conducted on Earth. Every interaction with the investigating agents became a high-stakes game of misdirection and concealment, where the slightest mistake could trigger revelations that would doom not only his personal mission but potentially the entire universe. The children's growing suspicion about their great-uncle's true identity and activities created additional complications for Stan's already precarious situation, as their natural intelligence and investigative instincts led them to ask exactly the kinds of questions that he could not answer without revealing truths that would put them in mortal danger. Their love and concern for him made deception increasingly painful, while their determination to help and protect him threatened to expose them to cosmic forces that no child should ever encounter. Dipper's discovery of the basement laboratory represented the nightmare scenario that Stan had worked for 30 years to prevent. The moment when his carefully constructed cover identity collapsed, and the full scope of his deception was revealed to individuals whose safety depended on their continued ignorance of the portal's existence. The revelation that their beloved great-uncle was not who he claimed to be shattered the children's understanding of their family relationships while simultaneously exposing them to knowledge that made them potential targets for forces whose power and malevolence exceeded anything in their previous experience. The activation sequence that began despite Stan's desperate attempts at prevention represented the convergence of multiple threats that he had been struggling to contain for decades, as government pressure, family investigation, and dimensional instability combined to create circumstances where the portal's operation became inevitable, regardless of the catastrophic consequences that would result. The machine's awakening sent shockwaves through multiple dimensions simultaneously, announcing to every entity capable of interdimensional perception that a new gateway between realities had become available for exploitation. The energy discharge that accompanied the portal's initial activation was visible from orbit, a column of reality-warping force that announced to anyone capable of detecting such phenomena that the barriers between dimensions had been fundamentally compromised in the vicinity of gravity falls. This cosmic beacon served as both warning and invitation, alerting entities throughout the multiverse that Earth's dimensional defenses had been breached, and that opportunities for invasion or exploitation were now available to any force capable of navigating interdimensional space. Ford's emergence from 30 years of exile in alternate dimensions brought with it knowledge and experience that fundamentally altered the stakes of the situation facing Gravity Falls and its inhabitants. His exposure to the broader multiverse had revealed the true scope of threats that existed beyond the boundaries of normal three-dimensional reality, while his encounters with other versions of Bill Cipher across multiple realities had demonstrated that the triangular demon's influence extended far beyond any single universe or timeline. The reunion between the estranged brothers was complicated by decades of accumulated guilt, resentment, and misunderstanding that had been compounded by the extreme circumstances of their separation and the cosmic nature of the threats they now faced together. Stan's 30 years of sacrifice and dedication in maintaining the portal had come at enormous personal cost, while Ford's experiences in alternate realities had exposed him to forms of knowledge and horror that had fundamentally altered his understanding of reality and his place within the larger cosmic order. The immediate aftermath of Ford's return was dominated by the urgent need to assess and contain the dimensional damage that the portal's activation had created, as energy readings indicated that the barriers between realities had been weakened across a broad area surrounding Gravity Falls. The risk of spontaneous dimensional rifts opening throughout the region created an ongoing threat to local stability that required constant monitoring and intervention to prevent catastrophic expansion of the affected zone. The children's exposure to these cosmic realities forced them to confront truths about the nature of existence that most adults never encounter, challenging their understanding of family, identity, and the relationship between individual choices and universal consequences. Their discovery that their summer vacation had placed them at the center of multiversal conflicts that threatened the existence of countless realities transformed their innocent adventure into a form of cosmic responsibility that would define their understanding of themselves and their place in the universe for the remainder of their lives. Ford's warnings about Bill Cipher's broader agenda revealed that the demon's interest in Gravity Falls extended far beyond simple mischief or local chaos, to encompass plans for universal transformation that would replace ordered reality with the kind of madness and suffering that characterized the nightmare realm. The portal's activation had provided Bill with exactly the kind of dimensional weak point he needed to begin implementation of his ultimate goal of merging all possible realities into a single chaotic system under his absolute control. The revelation that their family's secret had inadvertently aided one of the most dangerous entities in the multiverse created a burden of responsibility that extended far beyond anything the children had previously imagined possible. Their summer of supernatural adventures had evolved into a situation where the choices they made and actions they took could affect not only their own welfare, but the survival of infinite realities populated by countless sentient beings, whose existence hung in the balance of conflicts they could barely comprehend. The knowledge that Bill's influence had been growing stronger throughout their time in Gravity Falls recontextualized every supernatural encounter they had experienced, revealing that what had seemed like random weirdness was actually part of a coordinated campaign to weaken dimensional barriers and prepare for the demon's eventual manifestation in physical reality. Their encounters with possessed individuals, reality warping phenomena, and otherworldly entities had all served the demon's agenda, while providing him with opportunities to study and manipulate the family members whose cooperation he would eventually need to complete his transformation of local reality. The portal's continued operation, even in its supposedly contained state, represented an ongoing threat to dimensional stability that could not be permanently resolved through technological means alone. The machine's interaction with cosmic forces beyond human understanding meant that its presence would continue to attract attention and influence from entities whose power and objectives transcended anything that conventional, defensive measures could effectively counter. The family's newfound knowledge of these cosmic realities created both opportunity and obligation, as their awareness of the threats facing not only their local community, but the entire multiverse demanded action. While their limited understanding and resources made effective intervention seem nearly impossible, the weight of such knowledge was itself a form of burden that would continue to influence their choices and relationships long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. In the moment when the barriers between dimensions finally shattered like glass struck by cosmic thunder, when the careful mathematical constraints that had held reality in its proper configuration dissolved into chaos, and when Bill Cipher's triangular form blazed across the sky of Gravity Falls like a golden wound torn in the fabric of existence itself, the universe crossed a threshold from which return would require sacrifices that no mortal mind could fully comprehend or willingly accept. This was not merely the arrival of a supernatural entity or the manifestation of otherworldly power, but rather the fundamental alteration of the basic principles that governed physical reality, consciousness, and the relationship between thought and matter. The transformation began at the precise center of Gravity Falls, radiating outward from the interdimensional rift like ripples spreading across the surface of a pond, except that these ripples carried with them alterations to the very nature of space, time, and causality that rendered normal physics not merely irrelevant, but actively misleading as a guide to understanding what was possible or impossible within the expanding zone of chaos. The sky itself became a canvas upon which Bill's will was painted in colors that had no names, because they existed outside the spectrum of light that three-dimensional beings were equipped to perceive or comprehend. The immediate physical changes to the landscape were both spectacular and terrifying, as familiar landmarks underwent transformations that violated every assumption about the stability and permanence of material reality. The water tower that had stood as a mundane symbol of municipal infrastructure for decades began floating through the air like a balloon filled with something lighter than helium but heavier than dreams, while the roads that had connected different parts of the community twisted themselves into impossible geometries that led everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Buildings that had housed generations of families found their architectural logic inverted and perverted, with staircases that climbed downward into sky and doorways that opened onto rooms larger than the structures that contained them. The laws of interior and exterior space became suggestions rather than requirements, as Bill's reality-warping influence transformed the town into a three-dimensional expression of non-Euclidean mathematics that hurt to look at and was impossible to navigate, using any form of logic derived from ordinary human experience. The residents of Gravity Falls, who were caught within the expanding bubble of chaos, found themselves subject to transformations that reflected Bill's twisted sense of humor and his complete indifference to human comfort, dignity, or survival. These changes were not random acts of violence, but rather carefully calculated expressions of the demon's philosophy that reality was nothing more than a cosmic joke whose punchlines involved the systematic humiliation and torment of beings foolish enough to believe in concepts like stability, order, and meaning. Some townspeople were transformed into living stone, their consciousness trapped within granite bodies that could perceive and think but could not move, speak, or interact with the world around them in any meaningful way. Others were converted into wooden sculptures that retained their awareness but found themselves decorating landscapes that shifted and changed according to Bill's whims, forcing them to watch helplessly as their community was transformed into a playground for cosmic horror. The psychological impact of these transformations extended far beyond the physical discomfort or inconvenience of inhabiting non-human forms. The victims retained their human consciousness and emotional responses, while being trapped in bodies that could not express those feelings or communicate their suffering to others. This created a form of isolation so profound that it transcended mere loneliness to become a fundamental disconnection from the basic social interactions that define human existence and provide meaning to individual consciousness. Bill's throne, constructed from the bodies of his victims and elevated high above the transformed landscape, served as both practical seat of power and symbolic statement about his relationship to the beings whose reality he had conquered. The pyramid, as it came to be known, was not merely a structure, but rather a living monument to suffering, built from conscious entities who had been transformed into architectural elements while retaining their awareness of their degraded status as building materials in the demon's grand design. The throne room at the pyramid's apex became the center of operations for Bill's campaign to extend his influence beyond the boundaries of Gravity Falls, to encompass first the entire planet and eventually all possible realities throughout the multiverse. From this elevated position, surrounded by the moans and pleas of his transformed victims, the demon conducted his orchestra of chaos with the casual indifference of an entity whose perspective on time and suffering transcended anything that human psychology could comprehend or effectively resist. The immediate priority for establishing permanent control over the area involved neutralizing any potential sources of organized resistance, beginning with the elimination of temporal authority structures that might coordinate effective opposition to his rule. Time Baby, the cosmic entity responsible for maintaining the proper flow of temporal events across multiple dimensions, represented exactly the kind of universal bureaucracy that Bill viewed as both obstacle and target for his campaign of cosmic vandalism. The destruction of Time Baby occurred with the kind of casual violence that characterized all of Bill's interactions with beings he considered inferior to his own cosmic status. The entity that had governed temporal flow across countless realities was eliminated not through epic battle or dramatic confrontation, but rather through the application of power, so overwhelming that resistance became meaningless rather than merely difficult. The ease with which this supposedly omnipotent figure was destroyed served as both demonstration of Bill's capabilities and warning to any other cosmic entities who might consider intervening to restore order. The psychological impact of witnessing such casual destruction of apparently omnipotent authority figures created a form of existential despair among the surviving witnesses that went beyond mere fear or horror to encompass fundamental doubt about whether any form of justice or order could exist in a universe where such arbitrary power was possible. If beings capable of governing time itself could be destroyed as easily as swatting insects, then what hope did ordinary mortals have of surviving or resisting such overwhelming cosmic tyranny? The hunting parties that Bill organized for his entertainment represented the demon's twisted approach to establishing psychological dominance over his new subjects, while simultaneously amusing himself through the systematic torment of beings whose terror and desperation provided him with a calm form of cosmic comedy that reflected his complete inability to understand or value the significance of individual consciousness and suffering. These organized pursuits of human prey were not motivated by hunger, territorial instinct, or any other comprehensible biological drive, but rather by Bill's alien sense of humor and his fascination with the way terror could transform rational beings into desperate animals whose actions became increasingly irrational and self-defeating as their circumstances grew more hopeless. The demon found endless entertainment in observing how quickly civilized behavior collapsed when beings were forced to confront their own mortality and powerlessness in situations where survival required abandoning the moral principles that normally guided their behavior. The survivors who managed to evade capture during these initial hunting expeditions found themselves transformed into a different kind of victim, forced to live in constant terror of discovery, while watching their community and everything they valued about their existence being systematically destroyed for the amusement of an entity whose motivations remained completely alien to human understanding. The psychological toll of such existence created forms of trauma and stress that exceeded anything that normal human psychology was equipped to process or survive. Dipper and Wendy's journey through the transformed landscape of their former home provided them with first-hand experience of how completely Bill's influence had altered not only the physical environment, but also the fundamental rules that governed cause and effect, space and time, matter and energy. Every step through the chaos zone required them to abandon assumptions about how reality functioned, and instead navigate according to principles that changed constantly, according to the demon's whims and the alien logic of nightmare realm physics. The floating objects, impossible architectures, and constantly shifting spatial relationships that characterized the transformed gravity falls created navigation challenges that went beyond mere physical difficulty to encompass cognitive dissonance so severe that sustained exposure threatened to drive observers insane. The human brain evolved to process information according to consistent physical laws, found itself overwhelmed by sensory input that violated every expectation about how matter and energy should behave in three-dimensional space. The creatures that had been summoned from the nightmare realm to serve as Bill's agents and enforcers represented forms of life that had evolved under conditions where chaos and suffering were the fundamental organizing principles of existence. These beings possessed capabilities and motivations that were specifically designed to cause maximum psychological and physical damage to inhabitants of ordered realities, making them perfect instruments for Bill's campaign to transform Earth into another version of the hellish dimension from which they had emerged. Each of these entities embodied different aspects of cosmic horror, from beings whose very presence caused madness in observers, to creatures that fed directly on fear, despair, and other negative emotions that their activities generated in their victims. Their collaboration with Bill was not based on loyalty or shared ideology, but rather on mutual benefit, as the demon's reality-warping activities created conditions that allowed these nightmare creatures to thrive, while their presence and activities served his agenda for spreading chaos and suffering throughout formally ordered dimensions. The psychological warfare that these entities conducted was far more sophisticated and effective than simple physical violence would have been, as they possessed intuitive understanding of how to identify and exploit the specific fears, insecurities, and psychological vulnerabilities that characterized individual human consciousness. Their attacks targeted not merely the body but the mind and spirit, creating forms of damage that could not be healed through conventional medical treatment, and that often proved more debilitating than physical injuries. Ford's torture at the hands of his former collaborator represented both personal revenge for past betrayals and systematic attempt to extract information that would facilitate Bill's expansion beyond the boundaries of gravity, falls to encompass the entire planet, and eventually all possible realities. The physical pain inflicted during these interrogation sessions was severe but secondary to the psychological torment created by forcing Ford to confront his own role in enabling the catastrophe that had destroyed everything he had spent his life trying to protect. The demon's approach to extracting information combined sophisticated understanding of human psychology with casual indifference to suffering that made traditional torture seem almost merciful by comparison. Bill's ability to directly access and manipulate consciousness meant that he could inflict forms of mental anguish that transcended anything achievable through purely physical means, while his temporal perspective allowed him to extend moments of agony across subjective eternities that left victims experiencing years of torment within minutes of objective time. The knowledge that Bill sought from Ford extended beyond mere technical information about dimensional travel and portal construction to encompass understanding of human psychology and social organization that would facilitate more effective control and manipulation of Earth's population once his influence expanded beyond the initial zone of conquest. The demon's questions revealed sophisticated awareness of human civilization's strengths and weaknesses, suggesting that his campaign for universal domination was based on careful analysis rather than mere chaotic impulse. Mabel's psychological prison, constructed from her own guilt and perfectionist tendencies, represented Bill's most sophisticated and cruel manipulation of individual human consciousness, demonstrating his ability to transform even positive emotions and noble intentions into instruments of torment and control. The fantasy world that trapped her was not obviously hostile or threatening, but rather seductively perfect, offering everything she believed she wanted, while simultaneously preventing her from engaging with the real challenges and responsibilities that defined authentic human existence. The genius of this psychological trap lay in its use of Mabel's own desires and insecurities as the mechanism of imprisonment, creating a situation where escape required her to reject not only the demon's false paradise, but also her own deepest wishes about how her life and relationships should develop. The prison was designed to be self-reinforcing, with each moment of happiness or satisfaction within the fantasy world, strengthening the psychological barriers that prevented her from recognizing the artificial nature of her experiences. The other inhabitants of this guilt-driven paradise were constructs created from Mabel's memories and expectations rather than genuine individuals with independent consciousness and agency, though their behavior and responses were sophisticated enough to maintain the illusion of authentic relationship for extended periods. These artificial companions were programmed to provide exactly the kinds of emotional satisfaction and social validation that Mabel craved, making the prospect of returning to real relationships with their accompanying complications and disappointments seem increasingly unattractive. The discovery that her perfect summer was an elaborate psychological manipulation forced Mabel to confront uncomfortable truths about her own character and motivations, particularly her tendency to prioritize personal happiness and emotional comfort over the more difficult but ultimately more meaningful challenges associated with genuine growth and authentic relationship. The realization that her desire for perfection had made her vulnerable to such manipulation represented a form of moral awakening that was both painful and necessary for her continued psychological development. The battle that eventually emerged between the forces seeking to liberate Gravity Falls from Bill's control and the cosmic entities defending the demon's newly established reality represented more than simple conflict between good and evil, extending to fundamental disagreements about the nature of existence, consciousness, and the relationship between individual agency and cosmic order. The stakes of this confrontation included not only the immediate welfare of the town's inhabitants, but the future development of human consciousness and its role within the broader cosmic community. The resistance efforts that developed among the surviving townspeople demonstrated both the resilience of human social structures under extreme stress and the limitations of conventional organizational approaches when confronting threats that operated according to principles that transcended normal understanding of conflict and strategy. Traditional military tactics and political organizing methods proved inadequate when facing an enemy whose capabilities included direct manipulation of physical reality, consciousness, and the basic laws that governed cause and effect. The psychological challenge facing anyone who attempted to organize effective resistance against Bill's rule included not only the practical difficulties of coordinating action under chaotic conditions, but also the existential challenge of maintaining hope and purpose when confronting evidence that individual agency and moral choice might be meaningless in a universe where arbitrary power could override any commitment to justice, truth, or compassion. The relationships between family members that had been strained by revelations about the portal and decades of deception were tested further by the extreme circumstances of apocalyptic crisis, forcing each individual to choose between personal safety and commitment to others while operating under conditions where the normal social structures and moral frameworks that might guide such decisions had been completely disrupted by the transformation of reality itself. The gradual recognition that defeating Bill would require not merely superior power or better tactics, but fundamental changes in the consciousness and relationships of those opposing him, created additional psychological pressure on individuals who were already struggling to process the traumatic effects of witnessing their entire world transformed into something unrecognizable. The suggestion that victory might require personal sacrifices that exceeded mere physical danger forced everyone involved to confront questions about identity, love, and the value of individual existence that most people never have to address directly. The countdown toward Bill's expansion beyond the boundaries of Gravity Falls created a sense of urgency that transcended local concerns to encompass the survival of human civilization and potentially all ordered reality throughout the Boatface multiverse. The knowledge that failure to prevent the demon's escape from his current zone of influence would result in the transformation of the entire planet into another version of the nightmare realm added cosmic weight to decisions that already carried enormous emotional and moral significance for the individuals making them. The final preparations for confronting Bill required not only tactical planning and resource gathering, but also psychological preparation for engaging with forms of power and consciousness that operated according to principles so alien to human understanding that direct contact threatened to drive observers insane. The challenge of maintaining coherent identity and moral purpose while confronting cosmic horror that transcended normal categories of experience represented a test of human consciousness that extended far beyond anything that evolution had prepared the species to survive or understand. The approach to the pyramid through the transformed landscape of Gravity Falls became both physical journey and symbolic passage through the various forms of chaos and suffering that Bill's influence had introduced to previously ordered reality, forcing the rescuers to confront not only external obstacles but also their own psychological responses to witnessing systematic destruction of everything they valued about their world and their relationships with others. The ascent through the pyramid's levels exposed them to increasingly concentrated forms of cosmic horror and reality distortion that tested not only their physical endurance, but also their psychological stability and moral commitment to completing their mission, despite the mounting evidence that success might require sacrifices that none of them were prepared to make or accept. In the aftermath of Apocalypse, when the smoke of cosmic battle has finally cleared and the impossible geometry of nightmare reality has been forcibly returned to the mundane angles and ordinary physics that characterize normal three-dimensional existence, there remains a peculiar form of silence that settles over landscapes where the fundamental nature of reality itself has been tested, stretched, and ultimately restored through sacrifices whose true cost can only be measured in the currency of memory, identity, and the irreplaceable essence of individual consciousness that makes each person uniquely themselves rather than merely another interchangeable component in the vast machinery of existence. The town of Gravity Falls, as it slowly reformed itself from the chaos that Bill Cipher's influence had imposed upon its streets and structures, bore the scars of transformation in ways both visible and hidden, obvious alterations to the physical landscape standing alongside psychological wounds that would require generations to fully heal. The buildings that had been twisted into impossible architectures gradually resumed their normal configurations, yet subtle wrongnesses remained in their angles and proportions, tiny deviations from perfect restoration that served as permanent reminders of how easily the ordered world could be transformed into something alien and hostile to human habitation. The residents who had been transformed into stone, wood, and other inanimate materials during the height of Bill's reign found themselves restored to flesh and consciousness, yet they retained clear memories of their time as unwilling architectural elements and decorative objects. This experience of existing as matter without agency, of possessing awareness without the ability to act or communicate, had created a form of trauma that transcended normal categories of psychological damage to encompass existential terror about the fundamental nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical embodiment. These survivors struggled to readjust to the simple act of inhabiting bodies that could move and speak according to their own volition, having spent weeks or months experiencing existence as purely passive observers, trapped within substances that responded only to external forces. The memory of helplessness so complete that even breathing had been impossible created lasting anxiety about bodily autonomy and the reliability of the physical systems upon which consciousness depended for its expression in three-dimensional reality. The children who had witnessed these transformations and participated in the final battle against cosmic horror found themselves forever changed by exposure to truths about reality that most adults never encounter, and that human psychology had not evolved to process or integrate into normal patterns of thought and behavior. Dipper and Mabel's understanding of their own significance within the larger cosmic order had been fundamentally altered by the recognition that individual choices and family relationships could determine the fate of entire universes, populated by countless sentient beings whose existence depended upon the outcome of conflicts they could neither perceive nor influence. The weight of such knowledge created a form of responsibility that extended far beyond normal childhood concerns about personal success, social acceptance, or family harmony to encompass awareness of their ongoing role as potential guardians of dimensional stability and cosmic order. Every decision they made, every relationship they formed, and every conflict they encountered now carried the additional dimension of possible consequences that could ripple outward through multiple realities to affect beings and civilizations whose existence they could barely imagine. This transformation from innocent children enjoying a summer vacation into individuals who had directly confronted and helped defeat one of the most dangerous entities in the multiverse created a psychological burden that would influence their development for the remainder of their lives. The memory of standing against cosmic horror and emerging victorious provided them with confidence and perspective that would serve them well in facing future challenges, yet it also isolated them from peers who had never experienced anything comparable to such ultimate stakes and cosmic responsibility. The sacrifice that had made victory possible continued to reverberate through the family's consciousness long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. As they struggled to process the full implications of what Stanley Pines had chosen to surrender in order to save not only their local community, but potentially all of reality from Bill Cipher's campaign of universal domination. The erasure of his memories had been presented as a necessary tactical maneuver, the only method available for permanently severing the demon's connection to their dimension and preventing his eventual return. Yet the true horror of this sacrifice lay not in its tactical necessity, but in its fundamental violation of everything that made Stan recognizably himself, rather than simply another elderly man sharing his physical appearance and basic biographical information. The memories that had been erased included not only his recollections of supernatural encounters and cosmic battles, but also the accumulated experiences, relationships, and emotional connections that had shaped his personality, values, and understanding of his place within the network of human relationships that gave meaning to his existence. The man who awakened after Bill's defeat possessed Stan's body, his voice, and access to basic factual information about his life, yet he lacked the experiential foundation that had transformed those raw materials into a unique individual consciousness with specific patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior. This was not merely amnesia in the conventional sense, but rather a form of existential death that had preserved the biological substrate while destroying the psychological architecture that had made Stan who he was rather than simply what he was. Ford's guilt over the role his research had played in creating the circumstances that ultimately required such a sacrifice added additional layers of psychological complexity to an already devastating situation. His 30 years of exile in alternate dimensions had been motivated by recognition that his collaboration with Bill Cipher had created threats too dangerous for any individual to face alone. Yet his eventual return had brought with it the very confrontation that had cost his brother the most essential aspects of his individual identity. The twin brother who had spent decades maintaining the portal and protecting the world from interdimensional threats had been transformed into a stranger who shared Stan's appearance but lacked access to the memories and experiences that had created the bonds of affection, understanding, and mutual support that had ultimately made Ford's rescue possible. The relationship they had shared, with all its complications and conflicts, had been built upon shared history that now existed only in Ford's memory, making him the sole custodian of experiences and emotions that could no longer be reciprocated or even acknowledged by the person who had shared them. Dipper and Mabel's relationship with their great-uncle faced similar challenges, as the man they had come to love and depend upon during their transformative summer in Gravity Falls had been replaced by someone who possessed no memory of the adventures they had shared, the lessons they had learned together, or the emotional bonds that had developed through shared danger and mutual support. Their grief for his sacrifice was complicated by the presence of his physical form and the tantalizing possibility that the memories they treasured might somehow be recovered or restored. The process of helping Stan rebuild his sense of identity without access to the experiences that had originally shaped his personality became a family project that required everyone to serve as external repositories for memories he could no longer access internally. Each story they told him about his past, each photograph they shared, and each familiar situation they helped him navigate represented an attempt to reconstruct something that had been irretrievably lost, while simultaneously creating new experiences that might eventually serve as the foundation for a different but equally valid form of individual consciousness. This reconstruction effort was complicated by the recognition that the Stan who emerged from this process would necessarily be different from the one who had been lost, shaped by different experiences and relationships than those that had originally formed his personality. The memories that the family shared with him were inevitably filtered through their own perspectives and priorities, creating a version of his past that was accurate in its basic facts, but necessarily incomplete in its emotional and psychological dimensions. The ethical questions raised by this situation extended beyond the immediate family to encompass broader philosophical issues about the nature of identity, consciousness, and the relationship between memory and selfhood. If Stan's essential identity had been destroyed along with his memories, was the person who bore his name and appearance actually the same individual, or rather someone new who happened to inhabit the same physical form? Did the family have the right to shape his new identity according to their understanding of who he had been, or should they allow him to develop entirely new patterns of thought and behavior based on his current experiences rather than their recollections of his past? The gradual recovery of some memories, triggered by familiar objects, situations, and emotional connections, provided hope that the damage might not be as complete or permanent as initially feared. Yet these recovered fragments were scattered and inconsistent, lacking the coherent narrative structure that normally binds individual memories into a comprehensible sense of personal history and identity. The Stan who began to emerge from this process was simultaneously familiar and strange, recognizable yet fundamentally altered by the gaps and distortions in his reconstructed understanding of his own past. The town's collective response to the aftermath of Weirdmageddon reflected broader patterns of how human consciousness deals with traumatic experiences that exceed normal categories of understanding and explanation. The official version of events, constructed through a combination of government cover-up and social consensus, transformed the cosmic battle into a more comprehensible narrative about natural disasters and temporary hallucinations caused by environmental factors that could be studied, explained, and ultimately controlled through conventional scientific and administrative methods. This collective amnesia served important psychological functions for community members who lacked the context and preparation necessary to integrate memories of reality-warping horror into their normal understanding of how the world functioned. The alternative explanations provided them with frameworks for processing their experiences that did not require fundamental alterations to their basic assumptions about the nature of existence, consciousness, and their place within the cosmic order. Yet this social forgetting also carried costs in terms of preparedness for future supernatural threats and understanding of the ongoing vulnerabilities that made gravity falls a focal point for interdimensional instability. The knowledge and experience that had been gained through direct confrontation with cosmic horror was largely lost to the broader community, leaving them potentially defenseless against future incursions that might exploit the same dimensional weaknesses that Bill Cipher had used to establish his foothold in their reality. The Pines family's unique position as custodians of accurate memories about what had actually occurred during Weirdmageddon created both privilege and burden, as they possessed knowledge that could potentially protect the community while being unable to share that information without risking their own credibility and social standing. Their awareness of ongoing threats and vulnerabilities had to be balanced against the psychological welfare of neighbors and friends who were better served by explanations that allowed them to maintain their normal routines and relationships without constant anxiety about cosmic dangers they could neither understand nor effectively resist. Ford's decision to continue his research while taking greater precautions against supernatural manipulation reflected his recognition that the knowledge gained through direct experience with Bill Cipher and other interdimensional Ford entities was too valuable to abandon. Despite its obvious dangers, his enhanced understanding of how cosmic threats operated and what defensive measures might prove effective represented resources that could prove crucial for protecting not only Gravity Falls, but potentially the entire world from future supernatural incursions. The new security measures he implemented included both technological improvements to his laboratory equipment and psychological protocols designed to prevent the kind of gradual manipulation and corruption that had made his original collaboration with Bill possible. These safeguards reflected hard-won wisdom about the subtle methods that superintelligent entities employed to influence human consciousness and decision-making. Yet they also acknowledged the inherent limitations of any purely human defensive strategy when confronting forces that operated according to principles that transcended three-dimensional understanding. The siblings' relationship with each other, tested by decades of separation and misunderstanding, began a slow process of healing that was complicated by Stan's memory loss, but ultimately strengthened by their shared commitment to protecting their family and community from future supernatural threats. The experiences they had undergone during Weirdmageddon had demonstrated both their individual strengths and their greater effectiveness when working together, rather than allowing pride and misunderstanding to drive them apart. Dipper and Mabel's eventual return to California carried with them knowledge and perspectives that would fundamentally alter their approach to education, relationships, and life planning for the remainder of their existence. The summer that had begun as a simple vacation with a relative they barely knew had transformed into a cosmic adventure that provided them with insights into the nature of reality, consciousness, and moral responsibility that would influence every major decision they made as they continued their development into adulthood. Their understanding of the connection between individual choices and universal consequences had been gained through direct experience rather than theoretical study, creating a form of wisdom that would serve them well in navigating future challenges, while also isolating them to some degree from peers who had never confronted comparable tests of character and commitment. The memory of standing successfully against ultimate evil would provide them with confidence and perspective that could help them face whatever difficulties their future lives might bring. The question of whether the cost of victory had been justified by its outcomes would continue to haunt the family's consciousness for years to come, as they struggled to balance their gratitude for the preservation of reality against their grief for what Stan had sacrificed to make that preservation possible. The knowledge that countless lives and entire civilizations had been saved through his choice provided comfort that was real but incomplete, unable to fully compensate for the personal loss that his family continued to experience every day. The man who had chosen to surrender his memories in order to save the universe had made that decision based on love and commitment to values that transcended personal survival or comfort. Yet the family members who survived to remember his sacrifice found themselves bearing the ongoing burden of grief for someone who was simultaneously present and absent, physically restored, but psychologically transformed in ways that made full recovery impossible. Despite their continued hopes and efforts, this particular form of loss, where the beloved person remained physically present but psychologically altered beyond recognition, created a type of mourning that normal social structures and support systems were ill-equipped to address or ease. The family found themselves grieving for someone who was not dead while simultaneously learning to love someone new, who happened to inhabit a familiar physical form and share basic biographical information with the person they had lost. The wisdom gained through their confrontation with cosmic horror included recognition that some victories could only be achieved through sacrifices that exceeded what any individual should reasonably be asked to bear, yet also understanding that the willingness to make such sacrifices when they became necessary represented one of the most noble expressions of human consciousness and moral development. Stan's choice had demonstrated that individual identity, precious as it was, could be surrendered when the alternative involved allowing infinite suffering to spread throughout the multiverse. This lesson in ultimate moral commitment would continue to influence how the family understood their responsibilities to each other and to the broader cosmic community of which they had learned they were inextricably a part. The summer that had begun with simple curiosity about local folklore had concluded with recognition that their choices and actions could affect the welfare of countless beings across multiple dimensions, creating obligations that would shape their understanding of ethics and purpose for the remainder of their lives. And so we reached the end of our journey through Gravity Falls' most disturbing depths, where summer adventures revealed truths too dark for most children's tales to contain or acknowledge. We have witnessed possession and sacrifice, madness and memory loss, the price of forbidden knowledge, and the cost of unconditional love that transcends even the boundaries between dimensions and the fundamental nature of individual identity. These episodes remind us that growing up means confronting uncomfortable truths about trust, identity, and the fragile nature of reality itself. Truths that most human consciousness prefers to keep safely buried beneath layers of comfortable assumption and willful ignorance. The horrors we have explored together were not the product of mere supernatural fancy or arbitrary creative darkness, but rather careful examinations of very real psychological and philosophical territories that every developing consciousness must eventually navigate if it hopes to achieve genuine maturity and authentic understanding of its place within the vast and often hostile cosmic order. The shape-shifting nightmares that challenged basic assumptions about identity and authenticity, the temporal madness that revealed how easily the pursuit of perfection could transform into a form of existential prison, and the demonic possession that demonstrated the vulnerability of individual autonomy to forces that operated according to principles completely alien to human understanding. All of these represented externalized manifestations of internal struggles that characterized the transition from childhood innocence to adult wisdom. Yet, in facing these shadows directly, in refusing to turn away from uncomfortable truths about manipulation, control, and the ease with which reality could be transformed into something unrecognizable and hostile, the Pines family discovered something profound about the nature of human resilience and the power of authentic relationship to transcend even the most devastating forms of cosmic horror. They learned that love could survive even the erasure of memory, that sacrifice could be its own form of heroism, and that some bonds between conscious beings possessed a durability that exceeded the apparent fragility of individual identity and biological existence. The psychological landscapes we have traversed tonight, the guilt prisons constructed from perfectionist expectations, the identity crises triggered by perfect duplication, the existential terror of discovering that one's own body could become a weapon against those one loved most. These represented not mere fictional nightmares, but rather accurate maps of psychological territories that every human consciousness must eventually explore if it hopes to achieve genuine understanding of its own nature and capabilities. The supernatural elements that characterized these adventures served not as escapist fantasy, but rather as amplification devices that made visible psychological and social dynamics that normally remain hidden beneath the surface of ordinary experience. The transformation of familiar celebration into unsettling education, the revelation that kindness could be weaponized through manipulation, and that trust could become a vulnerability to be exploited by those who understood human psychology well enough to predict and control emotional responses. These lessons carried weight that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of their supernatural presentation to encompass fundamental insights about how power operates in human relationships and how innocence can be systematically corrupted through exposure to forces that view consciousness as mere raw material for achieving objectives that transcend individual welfare or consent. The price paid for cosmic victory measured in the currency of memory and identity, rather than mere physical destruction, demonstrated that some forms of heroism require sacrifices that challenge basic assumptions about what individual consciousness can be asked to surrender in service of broader good. The knowledge that infinite realities populated by countless sentient beings could be preserved only through the voluntary erasure of one man's essential selfhood forced everyone involved to confront questions about the relationship between individual significance and universal responsibility that most philosophical traditions prefer to address through theoretical speculation rather than direct practical application. Rest now, knowing that even in the darkest mysteries that human consciousness can encounter or imagine, genuine connection between aware beings provides the light that guides wanderers home through territories where ordinary navigation fails and conventional wisdom proves inadequate for survival. The strange tales we have shared tonight wash over sleeping minds, like the whisper of wind through Oregon pines, carrying both darkness and comfort in equal measure, because they acknowledge honestly the genuine dangers that consciousness faces, while simultaneously celebrating the resilience and courage that make survival and growth possible even under conditions that exceed normal human preparation or understanding. Let these disturbing episodes remind you that reality remains far stranger and more fragile than most people dare imagine or acknowledge, yet also far more responsive to conscious choice and moral commitment than cynical worldviews would suggest. The universe that contains both Bill Cipher and the love that ultimately defeated him is neither arbitrarily hostile nor automatically benevolent, but rather a cosmos where the outcome of ultimate conflicts depends upon the choices made by individual conscious beings whose significance cannot be measured by conventional standards of power or influence. Sleep well, strange dreamer, and remember that the capacity for both horror and heroism lies dormant within every human heart, waiting to be awakened by circumstances that reveal what each individual consciousness truly values above comfort, safety, and the preservation of familiar illusions. The darkness we have explored tonight serves not as cause for despair, but rather as reminder that authentic courage can only emerge through direct confrontation with genuine threats, and that the strongest bonds between conscious beings are forged not in safety, but in the crucible of shared danger, where each person's true character and deepest commitments become visible to themselves and others. In dreams tonight, may you find not the manufactured perfection that traps consciousness in cycles of artificial satisfaction, but rather the authentic imperfection that provides space for genuine growth, surprise, and the formation of relationships based on mutual recognition rather than psychological manipulation. The mysteries that remain unsolved become invitations rather than frustrations, doorways to exploration rather than barriers to understanding, and permanent reminders that consciousness exists within a universe vast enough to contain wonders that exceed any individual mind's capacity for complete comprehension or control.